Arthur Dayne opened his eyes to darkness and the taste of hot iron in his mouth. The immediate feeling was an ache that coursed through his bones, as though he had been lying in some dusty tomb for far too many years. Perhaps he had. He could recall a final stand at the Tower of Joy, the hush of dawn just before swords were drawn, and the glimmer in young Ned Stark's eyes, an honorable man bound to a promise. Fragments of memory slid by like shards of dream. The clash of steel, a sharp, searing pain in his stomach, the sight of his own blood upon the pale stone. Dayne remembered the end quite clearly, or thought he did. The fading swirl of sky as he collapsed, body going cold and limp, all light fading into blackness. So how was it he was here now, somewhere dark and wet, with a throbbing pain in his limbs? A faint flicker of red light danced across the walls. His fingertips found cold stone beneath him, and he slowly pushed himself upright, searching for a foothold on the uneven floor. The air smelled of old salt and wetness that brought to mind a seaside cavern. But there was also a pungent odor, reminiscent of pitch and burning incense. In the distance, he heard low chanting, a peculiar language unfamiliar to his ears. He had learned the tongues of the Seven Kingdoms and even a smattering of foreign speech when he served Prince Rhaegar, but these words were strange. They pressed into his mind with an alien insistence, winding around him as though weaving a net of sound. With strained caution, Arthur Dayne edged along the stone wall, palms pressed to the damp rock, until he saw a glow reflected upon the wet floor. He stepped toward it, gathering his courage. He was no stranger to darkness or to the unknown. Though memory told him he should be dead, the burning in his muscles reminded him he was very much alive, and the question of how would have to wait. Before him lay a narrow opening, the red glow dancing on jagged rocks. And beyond that opening, somewhere in the gloom, men chanted in unison. He pressed through the cleft, feeling rough edges scrape against his arms. His eyes adjusted to the faint red glow cast by torches that burned without sputtering. The tunnel sloped downward. With every cautious step, Arthur willed his unsteady legs to remain strong. At least his instincts had not deserted him. The skills of a Kingsguard, the discipline of a knight, all hammered into him through years of dedication. Those were things that could not die, he told himself, even if the man had once perished. He clung to that training, using it to steel himself against confusion, fear, and the strangeness that threatened to overwhelm him. Step by echoing step, he went on, until the chanting suddenly rose to a crescendo. He paused at a bend in the tunnel. A wide chamber opened up, lit by a ring of torches set in rough-hewn sconces. The glow revealed robed figures, half a dozen or more, all dressed in deep crimson. Some wore masks of polished metal fashioned into the likeness of fiery suns. Others had hoods drawn low, their eyes reflecting the flickering light. In the center of the chamber stood a broad altar carved from black stone. The swirl and dance of the flickering flames made it appear as though shadows swam across the altar's surface in a serpentine pattern. Arthur Dayne swallowed, the dryness in his throat reminding him how long it had been since he had tasted water. He didn't know who these robed figures were, but they looked nothing like any maester, septon, or learned man he had known in Westeros. The Seven never demanded such dark rituals as far as he knew, nor did they hold ceremonies in hidden caverns. And yet, faint recollections of overheard talk in the Red Keep, or from Rhaegar's hushed speculations, returned to him. Rumors of shadowbinders from Ashai, priests of a foreign god named R'hllor, who worshipped flame and shadow. The Lord of Light, they called him. The memory coalesced. Elia Martell had once mentioned red priests in Volantis who walked with flaming staves, proclaiming the coming of a chosen savior. The notion had seemed exotic, distant as the far side of the world. Now, as Arthur stared at the robed worshippers, he suspected he had somehow fallen into the heart of it. One figure, taller than the others, turned toward him. The chanting died away. A hush fell upon the chamber, and torches crackled softly. Arthur tensed, expecting any manner of hostility, but no one rushed at him with blades. The tall priest's face was pale beneath the cowl, eyes gleaming as though lit from within. When he spoke, it was in a deep voice with a heavy accent. "Arthur Dayne." The knight swallowed again. The sound of his own name, spoken in such a place, rattled him more than he cared to admit. He tried to recall his sense of courtesy, knowing at least that if these priests had not slain him outright, perhaps they did not intend to do so. "I am he," he managed, his voice raw. "How do you know my name? You are known to us. You are a vessel, and your sword once drank the light of the morning." Kingsguard to Rhaegar Targaryen, the shining blade in the darkness. The priest gestured, and the others parted. "Come forward. This is the second birth you have been granted. You are the champion of dawn and dusk, the sword that returns." Arthur felt the small hairs on his neck rise. They spoke with an air of prophecy, and Rhaegar had been a man drawn to prophecy. Arthur had always been more practical, more grounded. His loyalty was to House Dayne, to the rightful king, to the oath he had sworn. Yet he felt compelled to step into the chamber, to see the black altar with his own eyes. A memory flickered. Dawn, the ancestral sword of House Dayne, pale as milk glass, rumored to be forged from the heart of a fallen star. He had last wielded it at the Tower of Joy. If he was indeed resurrected, had they found Dawn? Had they placed it in strange ritualistic use? The mere thought tightened his chest with anxiety. He came forward until he was but a few strides from the altar. The chanting had subsided, and all eyes were upon him. He felt the intensity of their stares, like living shadows behind those crimson hoods. Though unarmed, Arthur remembered how to hold himself with confidence, shoulders back, stance poised. He was a knight, even in the face of unimaginable strangeness. The tall priest withdrew his hood, revealing close-cropped black hair and eyes that glowed gold in the torchlight. "You died in the mountains of Dorne, Arthur Dayne. Your blood slicked the stones, and your name was carried away by desert winds. We have seen this, but the Lord of Light has plans yet for the sword of the morning. We have called your spirit back, breathed life into your cold limbs, for a purpose greater than mortal men can fathom." Arthur's head spun. Resurrection? He had heard of dark necromancies, tales of the White Walkers in ancient legends, or rumors of warlocks in Karth, but to be pulled back into a living body seemed beyond comprehension. "Why?" he rasped, uncertain whether to fear or be grateful. "What do you want of me?" "Your service," said the priest simply. "A war is coming, a war of ice and fire that will shape the fate of all. The prince who was promised may yet be found in the blood of dragons, in the east, and you must go to her. You must stand in the presence of the Targaryen queen who will reshape this world." Daenerys Targaryen, Arthur thought, though he dared not speak the name aloud just yet. He knew of Rhaegar's sister, the last living child of King Aerys II, rumored to have fled across the narrow sea. He tried to gather the threads of reason. If he truly was brought back by these red priests, their power was not to be underestimated. They spoke as though they had glimpsed the future, and though Arthur was no stranger to destiny, having served a prince who believed in prophecy, he had never imagined that his own role would outlast his own death. The chamber flickered, and he realized he was trembling, from pain, from thirst, perhaps from awe. One of the masked figures stepped forward, holding out a simple wooden cup brimming with water. The gesture contained no threat, so Arthur took it gratefully, drinking deep. The water was tepid but tasted like salvation. Another priest offered him a cloak, and he donned it, noticing he wore only tattered remnants of cloth about his waist and chest. "We have done all we can for you," said the tall priest. "Now you must leave this place, travel east, across the seas. Seek the one who remains of your king's line, she who calls herself Daenerys Stormborn. Stand in her presence, for your blade shall serve as both protector and judge. You must see for yourself if she is worthy of the dawn." Arthur said nothing for a moment. A swirl of confusion and acceptance whirled in his mind. Where else could he go? He had no place in Westeros if the world believed him dead. No family waiting for him. Ashera was gone. The Daynes presumably carried on without him. King Rhaegar was gone, their cause lost at the Trident. But if any Targaryen survived, perhaps that was the oath he could cling to, a faint echo of the vow he had sworn to defend that bloodline. And if these priests' words held truth, if Daenerys truly was the rightful heir, or chosen by some prophecy, then maybe his second life had a purpose. Without fully understanding the implications, he forced himself to incline his head in a solemn nod. "So be it," he said. "I will go to her, if that is why I have been brought back. But I must have Dawn, the sword of my house. Where is it?" The tall priest's lips twitched in an almost smile. "We have not laid hands on your sword. Dawn was claimed by your kin after your passing. Yet if the Lord of Light wills it, the blade will find its way to you in time. For now, you must trust in steel that can be found. You are still Arthur Dayne, with or without that fabled sword. Go, Knight of the Starfall, champion of the dawn. The darkness waits for no man." Arthur swallowed. He felt the weight of finality in that pronouncement. "I understand. You have my thanks," he said, though the words felt woefully insufficient for a group who had literally pulled him back from death. Still, there was nothing else to say. The Red Priest stepped aside, clearing a path to a narrow exit. The chanting resumed softly, as if to mark his departure. He clutched the cloak around himself and walked toward the torchlit corridor that would lead him to the surface, and to whatever life awaited him beyond. Arthur's first glimpse of the world outside came on a rocky shoreline beneath a sullen sky. Sharp-edged clouds rolled in from the sea, and the brine-scented wind ruffled his hair. He had no idea where he was. Dorne was a place of hot suns and golden deserts, but this place felt cold and bleak. The sun, though hidden behind clouds, seemed feeble, granting little warmth. He found a narrow path that led along the coastline. As he traveled, shivers racked his body, and he realized how weakened he still was. Food, shelter, these basic needs pressed upon him now. The priests had given him only water in that single wooden cup. No provisions, no guidance save their cryptic command to go east. Perhaps they expected him to rely on some miraculous assistance from their god. Arthur Dayne was not one to sit on a rock and pray for deliverance. He drew on his instincts, scanning the horizon, searching for signs of a settlement. Near dusk, the path rose to a cliff, and there he finally saw a cluster of huts below, hugging the coast. Smoke rose from a handful of chimneys. He made his way down a winding road, legs unsteady, pressing on in dogged determination. He reached the small fishing village as night approached. To the west, the sun fell in a swirl of red, and the sea turned black. A fisherman, an older man with leathery skin, stepped from his shack with a net slung over one shoulder. He regarded Arthur warily. Cloaked in rough cloth, hair disheveled, Arthur knew he must look like some beggar or a traveler lost at sea. Trying to maintain dignity, Arthur inclined his head. "Good evening," he said. "I am in need of shelter, if you'll spare it." The man's brow furrowed. "Where you come from, stranger?" Arthur hesitated. He had no coin, no papers, no explanation that would make sense. "I come from a long journey," he settled on. "I have nothing to pay, but I can work for a meal." The fisherman studied him for a moment, then nodded curtly. "I can spare some soup, at least. If you mend nets for me, that'll do." Relief flooded Arthur's tired limbs, and he followed the man into a modest hut. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and the warmth was a small mercy. Arthur introduced himself simply as Dayne, for if the name Arthur Dayne meant anything to these fisherfolk, it would likely raise more questions than answers. The fisherman didn't press him. He offered a simple meal, fish stew, thick with barley. Arthur ate it as if it were the finest fare. That evening he helped mend nets by candlelight. Simple, repetitive work was oddly soothing. It anchored him to the present, away from the swirling confusion of his resurrection and the talk of prophecies. One net was full of tears and tangles, and as he worked to untwist the lines, he found a small measure of calm. In the days that followed, Arthur learned the name of the fisherman, Tobin, and the name of the village, which was a small coastal hamlet in the Stormlands. Tobin's wife had died years ago, his children grown and moved inland. He sold fish to the nearest market town for a meager living. Arthur realized he had not traveled far from Dorne in the grand scheme of the world, but enough that the climate was cooler, the land more battered by storms. When he had regained some strength, Arthur spoke to Tobin of needing passage to the east. Tobin looked at him askance. "You want to go across the narrow sea, that it? To Essos?" Arthur nodded. "I do. I must." Tobin snorted. "Essos is a big place. Plenty of sellswords return with empty pockets or not at all. You got a plan once you get there." Arthur's plan was half-formed at best. The priests told him to seek Daenerys Targaryen. Rumors said she had found refuge in the free cities, possibly beyond, maybe as far as Slaver's Bay. He only knew he needed to head east, and each step would reveal the next. "I will find my path," he said simply. Tobin shrugged. "Well, ships sail from Storm's End or from King's Landing across the sea. If you've not the coin, you might sign on as a guard or hire on with a merchant crew." At the mention of King's Landing, Arthur felt his heart twist. The seat of the Iron Throne, where once King Aerys reigned, where Prince Rhaegar had once walked. Now it was likely under the rule of Robert Baratheon, the usurper who had crushed the Targaryen forces. If Arthur went there openly, would anyone recognize him? He was supposed to be dead, but the risk was great, and the city was full of eyes and whispers. The name Dayne might carry weight or suspicion. Yet King's Landing was also the busiest port in the Crownlands, with ships sailing to Pentos, Bravos, Myr, and beyond. If he wanted to find quick passage across the sea, that was the best place to go. Perhaps he could keep a low profile. After all, how many remembered his face after all these years? Many of his old comrades were dead or scattered. Even so, he must be cautious. Arthur decided he could at least travel to Storm's End first, but that stronghold was also in Baratheon lands, and it might be no safer than King's Landing. Still, the fishermen agreed to take him part of the way in a small boat, carrying fish up the coast to a larger harbor. From there, Arthur could find his next step. Before dawn on the appointed morning, Arthur knelt on the stony beach, letting the waves lick around his boots. He whispered a silent vow to the memory of his sister, to his lost king, to the memory of Ned Stark at the Tower of Joy. He did not fully understand this second life, but if the Lord of Light, or whatever power, had brought him back, he would not waste it. If Daenerys Targaryen yet lived, perhaps she was the spark that Rhaegar had believed in for so long. Perhaps she was the one who could unite the 7 kingdoms against the threat that lay beyond. Arthur could not see that far. All he could do was walk the path. Tobin's boat bobbed in the surf, and Arthur climbed aboard. The fishermen hoisted sails, and they set off along the coast. A stiff breeze carried them, the morning sun gradually burning away the chill of night. Arthur felt each jolt as the boat crested the waves. Though he said little, his mind churned with memories, regrets, and guarded hope. Their trip was uneventful, save for a storm that blew in suddenly one afternoon, forcing them to anchor in a hidden cove. Tobin cursed the weather. Arthur helped where he could, but he was no seasoned sailor. The hours passed in tense waiting, battered by wind and rain, until at last the storm receded. By the time they reached a modest harbor town, both men were exhausted. Tobin intended to sell his fish there, then return home. Arthur gave the man a final word of gratitude, for though it was a small mercy, it had meant everything to him. Tobin merely waved it off. "Every man's lost at some time or another," he said gruffly. "Just be sure you find what you're looking for." With that, Arthur stepped onto the dock. He had a small bit of coin Tobin had insisted he take as a share of their fish haul. More importantly, he had his life and his purpose. Even if that purpose felt vague, it was better than drifting aimlessly. He inquired around the docks about ships bound east. Most were coasters, local vessels that traveled from port to port along Westeros, or fished the deeper waters. Larger trading galleys might come through from time to time. The captain of one such vessel told Arthur he was headed to Gulltown in the Vale, not across the narrow sea. Another merchant suggested King's Landing as the place to find a direct crossing. So it would be. Arthur set out on foot, following the coastal road that led south. The road was muddy and rutted, dotted with villages and the occasional holdfast. He skirted around any place that looked too large, wary of questions. He kept his hood drawn, traveling at a steady pace. At night, he slept in haylofts or beneath trees, forging on by dawn. His body, though resurrected, had not returned with the full vigor he had possessed in his prime. He still tired easily, though each day's walking seemed to strengthen him. Bit by bit, King's Landing came into sight. The city sprawled near the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, its walls rising around a mass of slate rooftops and winding streets. Arthur remembered it in times of Targaryen rule, the Red Keep's towers gleaming in the sun, the dragon pit perched on the hill of Rhaenys. Now the Red Keep belonged to a man who had ended Rhaegar's dream. Still, Arthur told himself he would not linger. All he needed was a ship. He entered through the Gate of the Gods, blending with merchants and travelers. The city assaulted him with noise. Hawkers shouting their wares, horses clopping on cobblestones, pigs squealing in pens, fishwives gossiping on corners. The smell was equally jarring, a blend of smoke, sweat, and refuse that hammered the senses. Arthur pressed on, keeping his cloak tight. He had no illusions. If recognized, he might be seized as an enemy of the crown, or someone might try to sell him to the highest bidder. Still, curiosity pricked him as he passed through Flea Bottom's grimy alleys. He saw small children darting underfoot, a weaver shouting from a window. He glimpsed the looming towers of the Red Keep above the city, half obscured by the haze. How many ghosts walked these streets? He remembered riding at Prince Rhaegar's side through these avenues when the common folk cheered for their silver-haired prince. That world was gone. At the docks, wooden piers jutted into the muddy waters of the Blackwater Bay. Ships from the free cities were moored there. Pentoshi carracks, Myrish galleys, and lean Bravosi vessels with figureheads carved into fearsome shapes. Sailors bustled about with crates, barrels, and coiled ropes. Arthur kept an eye out for a captain who might be amenable to taking on a passenger without prying too deeply into his identity. A black-bearded captain named Cade was preparing his Myrish galley, the Sea Falcon, for a return voyage to Pentos. Arthur approached him quietly. "I need to travel to Pentos," he said, conscious that he had only a few coins. "I can offer my services in exchange for passage. I'm skilled with a sword." Captain Cade eyed him. "Plenty of men skilled with swords. Not all worth the trouble. You some sells word down on your luck." "One might say so," Arthur replied, keeping his tone modest. "I also have a strong back for labor if need be." Cade shrugged. "It's a short voyage. You can stand guard over my cargo if it suits you. I pay cheap, though." "I only need passage," Arthur said. Cade spat over the side of the dock. "Done then. We sail at dawn. Be here by first light, or the Sea Falcon leaves without you." Arthur nodded. That was enough. He left the docks with a new sense of momentum. Before nightfall, he managed to purchase a half-loaf of bread and some dried fish with his remaining coin. He found a corner of the docks where he could sleep under a canopy that jutted from an abandoned warehouse, out of the rain. He dozed fitfully, half expecting gold cloaks to appear and drag him away. But none came. The city slept around him with its usual hum of vice and survival. At dawn, the Sea Falcon cast off from King's Landing. Arthur stood on the deck, the gulls crying overhead. He watched as the Red Keep shrank into the distance, the city's walls melting into the horizon. A flood of old memories tried to rise within him. Images of a life that was gone, of a young man who had believed in Rhaegar's dream of a better realm. Arthur breathed deeply of the salt air, pushing those recollections away. He had a new path now, one that led across the sea to Daenerys Targaryen. The crossing was not long, but the ship encountered squalls, forcing them to tack repeatedly, lengthening their journey by days. Arthur spent the time enduring seasickness and performing menial tasks. He coiled ropes, helped the sailors secure crates, and stood watch at night, peering into the starlit waters. The men on board joked about him being a quiet sort, but most left him alone. Captain Cade asked few questions, which suited Arthur. At last, the towers and domes of Pentos appeared, sprawling along the coast. Large merchant palaces glittered in the sun, orange-tiled roofs shining like copper. Arthur had never been to Pentos before, only heard rumors of its lavish feasts and the power wielded by its magisters. As the sea falcon docked, Arthur felt a pang of uncertainty. He was a stranger in a strange land, with no contacts and little coin. Yet this was the next step. He disembarked, drawing the hood over his face against the bright sunlight. At a bustling quay, cargo was unloaded, and the swirl of foreign tongues enveloped him. Pentoshi in bright silks bargained with Myrish traders. Slaves carried goods from the holds. Arthur's expression tightened at the sight of the shackled men and women. Slavery was outlawed in Westeros, but here it was a way of life. He forced himself to move on, searching for an inn or a tavern where he could glean any news of Daenerys Targaryen. Word on the street was that the last known Targaryen princess had indeed traveled through Pentos once, under the patronage of a magister named Illyrio Mopatis, but she had long since departed. Some said she had gone to the Dothraki Sea, a bride to a great call. Others claimed she had perished in the Red Waste. Still others whispered she had hatched dragons and seized rule of a city called Meereen, far away in Slaver's Bay. Dragons hatched? Arthur found the notion incredible, yet rumors were persistent. Talk of living dragons had spread across Essos like wildfire. Some scoffed at it as a tall tale, but he had heard stranger truths. If the Targaryen line indeed boasted dragon's blood, and if Daenerys had awakened those beasts from stone eggs, perhaps that alone was reason enough to investigate. For if she commanded dragons, she might well be the mightiest force in the known world. With these rumors in mind, Arthur realized his path might take him far beyond the free cities, all the way to Slaver's Bay. He had to find a way to reach Meereen, if that was truly where she reigned. Yet he had no coin, and Slaver's Bay was halfway around the world. Without resources, he could easily end up enslaved himself if he stumbled into the wrong place. He found a small tavern in a back alley, the Hanging Crescent, whose sign was chipped and faded. The proprietor, a stooped man with a greasy apron, grudgingly gave Arthur a corner to sleep in exchange for washing pots and sweeping floors. Arthur endured it. A few coppers in his pocket each day was better than nothing. He listened to travelers who passed through, gleaning scraps of information about the goings-on in the east. Some men boasted of visiting Qarth, describing the city's wonders, but none had ventured to Meereen since the Targaryen queen's rumored conquests. Others spoke of Volantis, the largest of the free cities, with its temple to the Lord of Light dominating the skyline. Arthur recalled the Red Priests who had raised him. Perhaps in Volantis, he could learn more of his own fate, or secure passage further east. So Arthur left Pentos behind, traveling with a caravan that was bound for Volantis. He signed on as a guard, though he had only a borrowed sword, a chipped longsword of no repute. Still, he was more than capable enough to repel bandits. The caravan master, a stout fellow named Omero, was carrying fine Pentoshi textiles to sell in Volantis. The journey was long, crossing roads that grew ever more dusty, passing through villages where the people spoke a jumble of Valyrian dialects. Arthur kept mostly silent, eyes ever alert. At night, they circled wagons and made fires, singing songs in half a dozen tongues. Arthur felt forever on the outside, a ghost moving among the living. Sometimes he wondered if he truly was a specter, brought back only to wander until he found Daenerys or perished again. But each morning, the ache in his muscles reminded him he was all too mortal. After many weeks, the caravan reached the outskirts of Volantis. Arthur gazed upon the colossal walls, overshadowed by the famed black walls of Old Volantis at the city's heart. The long bridge arched over the waters, crammed with shops, homes, and throngs of people. Smoke rose from countless chimneys, and the heat was stifling. Volantis was older than King's Landing by thousands of years, and its wealth and influence were vast. Arthur had never seen anything quite like it. Not even the labyrinthine sprawl of King's Landing could compare to the ancient might in the bricks of Volantis. They parted ways at a trading post outside the gate. Arthur thanked Omero for the safe journey, receiving a small handful of coins for his service as a guard. It was enough to afford him a meager lodging for a few nights. More importantly, it gave him time to search out the Temple of the Lord of Light. Perhaps those red priests would know something of his destiny, or at least be less startled to see him than any other sect. Sure enough, the site of the temple was unmistakable. A towering structure of black and red marble, topped by a massive dome, with flames carved into the facade. Nightly, the temple was illuminated by a ring of torches so vast that it seemed to set the sky aglow. Arthur approached its great doors, guarded by men in scarlet robes and gilded helms shaped like the sun. He expected to be turned away, but when he whispered that he came at the behest of Lawler's servants in Westeros, the guards stiffened in surprise. One guard motioned him inside, muttering something in a language Arthur did not follow. The temple's interior soared overhead, lit by braziers. Fragrant incense drifted through the air, and the chanting of priests echoed in the corridors. A robed acolyte led Arthur to a smaller antechamber where a high priest waited, a man with a shaved head and elaborate tattoos on his cheeks. This high priest introduced himself as Benero. Arthur bowed his head, uncertain of the proper form of respect. "I was brought back by red priests in Westeros," he said quietly, deciding to be direct. "They told me I must find Daenerys Targaryen in the east. I seek any knowledge you can share." Benero's expression flickered. He stepped closer, eyes gleaming with the fanatic light Arthur had come to associate with the worshippers of Lawler. "Arthur Dayne," he said, voice echoing in the chamber. "They named you the Sword of the Morning. I have heard the whispers. The Lord of Light has guided your path here. You know of me?" Arthur asked, though by now he was less surprised by such knowledge. "The flames show us many things. Daenerys Stormborn is in Meereen, across the Red Waste, by the Skahazadan River in Slaver's Bay. She has captured the city, freed the slaves, and awoken dragons that once slept in stone." Benero's voice rang with a fervent reverence. "She is a breaker of chains, a mother of dragons. Some claim she is Azor Ahai reborn, the savior who shall stand against the darkness." Azor Ahai reborn, another prophecy Rhaegar had once studied, though Rhaegar believed the prince that was promised was someone else. Yet now, decades later, the world had changed, and so had the signs. "You believe Daenerys is this prophesied hero?" Arthur asked. "Why resurrect me, then? I am no dragon lord." "Lawler shows only glimpses," Benero said. "But you are tied to her fate. Dawn and dusk must meet, and your blade is said to herald the new day." "So we were shown." Arthur inclined his head. Perhaps it was true, or perhaps it was just the zealotry of these priests. Still, he sensed a thread of destiny weaving through it all. Daenerys Targaryen was no mere pretender. If she had truly hatched dragons, she commanded a power unseen in the world for centuries. If she was also fighting to free slaves, perhaps she had the makings of a just ruler. Arthur could almost hear Rhaegar's voice whispering of a golden age, a united realm at peace. He asked Benero about travel to Meereen, about the dangers of the journey. The priest explained that Volantis was itself in upheaval. Many highborn families resented Daenerys' actions, as they owned large plantations with slaves. Others, including slaves themselves, adored her, calling her Mysa and believing she would come to liberate them. Tensions simmered. Still, caravans and ships traveled to Slaver's Bay. Benero offered to arrange passage if Arthur would serve the cause of the Lord of Light. Arthur accepted the help, suspecting that it came with invisible chains of its own, but he had little choice. Within days, Benero found a merchant cog headed to New Guise, a port city near Meereen. The ship belonged to a merchant sympathetic to the Red Temple, carrying goods for trade. Arthur boarded it quietly, mindful that he was once again moving closer to the rumored queen. The journey took weeks, skirting the coastlines, crossing the summer sea. Arthur spent the time on deck, occasionally joining the crew in tasks. The nights were hot, the sun punishing by day. His Westerosi cloak became stifling, but he kept it to hide the battered armor he had managed to purchase in Volantis. A simple boiled leather jerkin and a steel half-helm. It was not the shining plate of a Kingsguard, but it sufficed. His borrowed sword was sharpened as best he could manage. They reached New Guise under scorching midday heat. From there, Travelers could follow the coast to Meereen or attempt an overland route through hostile territory. The region was in turmoil. Daenerys's conquests had upended the balance of power. Even as a theoretical ally, Arthur could expect danger from slavers, sellswords, and rebellious forces. The rumor was that Yunkai and other cities had allied to try to retake Meereen. War was brewing in Slaver's Bay. Arthur sold what few possessions he didn't need, gathering enough coin to buy a sturdy horse. Setting out from New Guise, he joined a small group of travelers heading north, hoping to reach Meereen's walls. The roads were dusty and scattered with the bones of those who had succumbed to the harsh climate or to raiders. Arthur slept lightly, sword always near at hand. He found himself relying on the discipline he had honed in the Kingsguard, always watchful, always prepared for an ambush. And indeed, bandits attacked them one night. Arthur fought with a fierceness he had not summoned in years. Though the battle was short and brutal, he survived without serious injury, dispatching 2 assailants with swift strokes. The other travelers were equally determined, and the bandits fled. The next morning, Arthur gazed upon the sunrise with a solemn sense of purpose. His resurrection was not some idle event. He was back in the living world, facing mortal struggles in a land far from home, all to stand before a woman he had never met, a queen crowned by war and dragons. Perhaps he would find his true calling in her service, or perhaps she would prove to be just another tyrant. But he would see for himself. At last, the group reached sight of Meereen. The city rose along the banks of the Skahazadan River, with pyramids piercing the skyline. The largest pyramid bore a great bronze harpy, though rumor said Daenerys had torn down the harpy's statue in her attempt to rid the city of its old symbols of oppression. Dragons had been seen perched on the city's walls, so the tales went. The approach was tense. Soldiers patrolled the outskirts, a mixture of freedmen and sellswords loyal to Daenerys, as well as contingents that might have come from other cities to treat with her. Arthur kept his hood drawn. He approached the gates, explaining he was a Westerosi knight come to see the queen. The guards, suspicious, nearly turned him away, but another soldier, hearing Arthur's accent, insisted on taking him to an official. The official turned out to be a former slave from Astapor, who now served as a clerk. The clerk had never heard of Arthur Dayne, but recognized the significance of a Westerosi knight. "You seek an audience with Daenerys Stormborn?" the clerk asked warily. "She receives many petitioners, but who are you to demand her attention?" "I do not demand, only request," Arthur said. "I served House Targaryen in Westeros many years ago. I have come to pledge my sword, if she will have it." The clerk frowned. "We have heard from many sellswords who offer their blades for coin. The queen is not always welcoming to men who come unproven. I ask only for the chance to stand before her," Arthur said, thinking how strange it was to speak of Daenerys as queen. Once he had served her brother, a man she never knew. "If I fail to impress her, then I will depart without complaint." The clerk shrugged. "You will wait among the other petitioners, then." Thus began a period of waiting. Day after day, Arthur lingered in the outer district, among the throngs of people hoping to see Daenerys. Freedmen queued for hours to air grievances. Noblemen from nearby cities brought gifts to curry favor, and ex-slavers came to beg for the return of confiscated property. The city itself was in a precarious state. Tensions simmered, violence erupted at times in the streets, and the Sons of the Harpy, a masked resistance group, carried out murders in the shadows. Arthur spent his days observing, doing small mercenary tasks to earn enough to eat. He could see the cracks in this new regime. Daenerys had liberated the slaves, but old hatreds lingered. Keeping the peace seemed a monumental challenge. Finally, a soldier wearing the sigil of the Unsullied approached Arthur. The soldier spoke in broken common tongue, summoning him to the Great Pyramid. Arthur followed, feeling a flutter in his stomach. He ascended the steps into a vast throne room carved from pale stone. Torches lined the walls, and high windows let in beams of harsh sunlight. There, upon a throne of polished bronze, sat Daenerys Targaryen. She was younger than Arthur had imagined, silver gold hair braided and pinned. Her attire was simple yet regal, no crown, but an air of command. 2 guards flanked her. One was a tall man with a black beard and mismatched eyes. The other wore the leathers of a knight from Westeros. The hush in the room pressed in on Arthur's ears. He stepped forward, nerves taut. This was the daughter of the Mad King, the sister of Rhaegar. He had expected more echoes of Rhaegar in her face, but perhaps it was there in the tilt of her chin or the shape of her eyes. Her gaze was sharp, inquisitive. The black-bearded guard boomed out, "State your name and purpose." Arthur inclined his head. "I am Arthur Dayne, once a sworn knight of the Kingsguard under Prince Rhaegar Targaryen." A ripple of reactions went through the hall. Some looked confused, others skeptical. Surely the name was known, for Arthur Dayne had been famed for his prowess. But also, the man was supposed to be long dead. "I come to offer my fealty to Daenerys Stormborn, if she will accept it." Daenerys's eyes narrowed slightly. "Arthur Dayne died at the Tower of Joy. That is the story I know. My brother Rhaegar spoke of you as his finest knight, but that was many years before my birth. How can this be?" Arthur took a steadying breath. "It is true, perished in Dorne, but I was brought back by the Red Priests. The Lord of Light saw fit to give me a second life, for reasons that I am only beginning to understand. I have traveled far, from Westeros to Essos, to stand here now." A palpable tension filled the throne room. Some might have scoffed at such a claim, but Daenerys had seen stranger things. She had hatched dragons from stone eggs. She studied him a moment more. Then she spoke softly. "If you are truly Arthur Dayne, you must remember a great many things. My brother Rhaegar told me little of you, but Ser Barristan Selmy told me more." Ser Barristan. The knight with silver hair and lined features stepped forward. Ser Barristan Selmy, a legend in his own right. He peered closely at Arthur. "My lady," he said, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "If this man is Arthur Dayne, he was once my comrade in the Kingsguard. I knew him well, though we parted before the fall. There are questions I could ask that only he would know." Daenerys nodded. "Ask then." So Ser Barristan did, in a soft voice that did not carry to the onlookers. "What name did Prince Rhaegar use when he walked among the small folk in disguise?" Arthur replied quietly. "He went by the name of the Silver Harp or simply a singer. But if you mean a more mundane alias, sometimes he was called Randall, though that was only if we were traveling to a tavern. He never liked deception, but found it necessary." A flicker of emotion crossed Ser Barristan's face. "And what gift did Prince Rhaegar give you upon your knighthood?" Arthur recalled it vividly. A silver-chased scabbard, inlaid with amethysts. He called it a small token for the Sword of the Morning, though he knew I carried Dawn. Ser Barristan's voice caught. "Yes, that was it." He turned to Daenerys, voice certain now. "Your Grace, this an answer's true. I do not know how it is possible, but he is indeed Arthur Dayne, or he has knowledge only Arthur Dayne could possess." Daenerys's violet eyes gleamed with wonder, confusion, and perhaps a flicker of hope. "So it seems. There is much I wish to ask you, Ser Arthur." She spoke those words gently, acknowledging his title in a quiet acceptance that he was who he claimed to be. "But you have come to pledge yourself to me? Why?" Arthur knelt, bowing his head. Memories of Rhaegar, of what might have been, flashed through his mind. "I once served the Targaryen bloodline, and though that line was nearly ended, I vowed to defend it with my life. I failed. Now I am given another chance. I do not fully understand it myself, but I believe it is my duty to serve the rightful queen, to see the dream that Prince Rhaegar held brought to life. If you will accept me, your grace, I will stand by your side." The hall was silent, save for the crackle of torches. Then Daenerys spoke, her voice resonating through the high chamber. "Rise, Ser Arthur Dayne. I have heard of your honor, your skill with a blade. If the Lord of Light has truly returned you to life, then I will not scorn such a gift. I accept your oath. Serve me well, and together we shall see if the 7 kingdoms can be freed from usurpers, and if all people might someday know peace." Arthur rose, meeting her gaze. He sensed a warmth in her tone, but also a steely resolve that Rhaegar had sometimes lacked. This was a woman forged by exile, shaped by hardship. She was both tender and fierce. He inclined his head, heart beating heavily. "I am at your service, your grace," the assembled onlookers murmured, some uncertain, others clearly in awe. Ser Barristan stepped closer and clasped Arthur's shoulder. "There is much to discuss, old friend," he said, voice filled with a mix of joy and sorrow. "Welcome home, though this is far from Westeros." Daenerys signaled her guards to escort Arthur to more private quarters. She would have questions for him, no doubt, and he had questions of his own for her. The 3 dragons that soared above the city, the freed slaves, the war that brewed beyond Meereen's walls, and the rumored threat that existed across the sea in Westeros as well. For the moment, though, Arthur felt a faint sense of fulfillment. He had come from darkness and confusion, but now he had a queen to serve again, and perhaps a new dawn to fight for. That night, as Arthur lay in a simple chamber in the Great Pyramid, he gazed out a narrow window. In the distance, moonlight revealed the silhouette of a dragon perched atop a broken harpy statue, wings half furled. He let out a slow breath. Rhaegar had believed in prophecies, in the prince that was promised. Arthur had once thought that was Rhaegar himself, or perhaps his children. Now, he wondered if Daenerys was the one to fulfill that ancient destiny. The Red Priests had insisted she might be Azor Ahai reborn. If so, a great war of ice and fire lay on the horizon. Arthur closed his eyes, recalling the words of the tall priest who had summoned him from death. A war is coming, a war of ice and fire that will shape the fate of all. He felt the echo of that vow reverberate in his bones. His service was just beginning, and the path ahead was uncertain. He might yet face old foes if the Targaryen queen decided to sail for Westeros, or new foes in Slaver's Bay who wished to crush her revolution. But for all these terrors, he had found a purpose again, and that, at least, was something worth living for. In the days that followed, Daenerys summoned him to her council. There he met her advisors. Missandei, a clever young woman once enslaved in Noth, Grey Worm, commander of the Unsullied, Dario Naharis, the flamboyant Sellsword with blue-stained hair, and of course, Ser Barristan Selmy, who welcomed Arthur like a brother reborn. They spoke of the war with Yunkai, of the revolt within Meereen's own walls, of the uneasy alliances Daenerys had forged. Arthur listened, careful not to overstep, still unsure of his new place. When Daenerys asked his counsel, he offered what knowledge he could of warfare, though Essos was far different from Westeros. At times, Daenerys asked him of her brother Rhaegar, what he was like, why he had risked everything for Lyanna Stark, what he had hoped for the realm. Arthur answered honestly, though it pained him to speak of old tragedies. He tried to paint a portrait of Rhaegar as the good man he had known, dreamy, yes, but also earnest, a prince who wanted to be a just ruler. Arthur did not dwell on Aerys' madness or the toll of the war on the small folk. Daenerys bore these stories quietly, her eyes distant. He sensed her wrestling with the legacy of her family, the burden of being the last of the Targaryens, until recently, at least. She had 3 young dragons now, Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion. They were growing quickly, and with them her power grew. But so did the responsibility. One evening, after a council session, Daenerys walked with Arthur along a terrace overlooking the city. The wind carried the scent of the river, tinged with spice from the markets below. Torchlight from the pyramids cast dancing shadows on the stone balustrade. Daenerys paused, resting her hands on the edge of the balustrade. "You pledged your sword to me, Ser Arthur. I wonder if you truly understand what that means. I am not my father. I do not wish to instill fear, nor do I cling to illusions of grandeur. I seek to break the chains of the oppressed, to bring an end to cruelties my family once allowed. Perhaps I seek to prove that House Targaryen can be something more. Do you believe that is possible?" Arthur considered her words, recalling how Aerys had grown paranoid and cruel. Daenerys was a different sort altogether. "I do," he said softly. "From what I have seen, you are not like the Mad King. You care for your people, you wish to free them. That alone sets you apart from many rulers. Whether Westeros will see it that way, or whether they still remember only fire and blood, I cannot say. But if you choose the path of justice, I will stand with you." She offered him a faint, grateful smile. "Thank you, Sir Arthur. There are times I feel very alone, burdened by the ghosts of my past and the uncertain future of my people. Barristan has been a comfort, telling me of the Kingsguard's code, reminding me that not all Targaryens are defined by my father's madness. Now you stand beside me too, a living piece of that history. I hope together we can forge a better future." He inclined his head. "As do I, Your Grace." In the weeks that followed, Arthur proved his worth on more than one occasion. When the Sons of the Harpy staged nighttime raids, he joined the Unsullied in defending the freedmen. While the Unsullied fought with discipline, Arthur's swordsmanship brought swift ends to the masked rebels. Each skirmish honed his skills anew. Rumors spread in Meereen that Daenerys' new knight was a wraith from Westeros, unstoppable, silent as the grave. The freedmen began to call him the White Sword of Dorne, though Arthur never donned white armor. Perhaps the memory of his old Kingsguard cloak was enough to inspire the rumor. He also trained some of Daenerys' new guard, freedmen who wished to learn the art of the sword. He taught them the basics of footwork, parrying, discipline. He was patient but firm, recalling how he had once been taught by his predecessors in the Kingsguard. Watching these newly freed people grasp swords for the first time, driven by gratitude and hope, kindled in him a sense of optimism. They fought for something they believed in. That was more than he could say for many lords who just fought for land or titles. All the while, the war outside Meereen escalated. Yunkai had rallied forces, and other slave cities joined them, forming a grand alliance determined to crush Daenerys. Envoys arrived, demanding the return of the city to its old masters, a reinstatement of slavery, and the removal of Daenerys from Slaver's Bay. She refused, vowing never to abandon those she had freed. The siege tightened, and supplies began to dwindle. Arthur stood by her side through these trials. He saw her wrestle with difficult decisions, whether to treat with old enemies, whether to deploy her dragons in battle and risk slaughter. He saw her unwavering compassion for the freedmen, even as some advisors urged her to adopt harsher measures. Day by day, she walked a fine line, forging alliances where she could, punishing the Sons of the Harpy when they spilled innocent blood. At times, Arthur found himself recalling the Red Priest's words about a great war of ice and fire. This local war, though brutal, might be only a prelude to something greater. He had heard rumors from Westeros of white shadows stirring beyond the wall, of undead whites. If Daenerys intended to rule the Seven Kingdoms, she would need to face that threat as well. Arthur saw the scope of the challenge and marveled at the weight on Daenerys' shoulders. Yet she pressed on, determined. Their next major confrontation came when the Yunkish legions finally encircled Meereen. The siege was nearly complete, and tension crackled through the city. Daenerys resolved to make a stand, calling upon her dragons. On the day the battle began, the sky was a leaden gray, heavy with the promise of rain. Arthur donned his battered armor, feeling the old thrill of battle in his veins. He stood on the walls with Barristan and Dario, peering across the battlefield where rows of Yunkish spearmen lined up under fluttering banners. Drums sounded, and the Yunkish advanced. The defenders on the walls launched arrows. The Unsullied formed ranks in the streets, and Arthur found himself leading a small contingent of freedmen archers. He bellowed commands, guiding them to fire in disciplined volleys. The Yunkish brought siege engines forward, lobbing flaming projectiles into the city. Smoke rose, fires breaking out in the lower districts. Then, Daenerys unleashed her dragons. Arthur saw Drogon first, a massive black shape rising from behind the Great Pyramid, with Rhaegal and Viserion following. Their roars shook the city. Many of the defenders stared in awe, forgetting to fire their bows. Arthur had seen dragons only from a distance before, perched on the city's walls, but to witness them in full flight, unleashing torrents of flame upon the besieging forces, was a sight that stole his breath. The Yunkish lines buckled in terror, men scattering before the onslaught. This was fire and blood, the Targaryen legacy unleashed. Arthur had no illusions about the horror it brought. Men burned alive, siege towers collapsed. Yet war seldom spared anyone from brutality. Daenerys might have chosen to minimize the chaos, but the Yunkai had forced her hand. Arthur urged his archers to keep up their volleys, mindful not to fall prey to illusions of invincibility. Even with dragons, victory was not guaranteed if the city's walls were undermined or the defenders were overwhelmed. Still, the dragons turned the tide. The Yunkish forces broke, retreating in disarray as the beasts soared overhead, raining down flames. Arthur led a charge outside the gates to harry their flank. His sword flashed, cutting through the confusion. Freedmen fought with him, raw but determined. Shouts and screams echoed all around, the thunder of hooves and the crackle of flames. Arthur pressed on, always seeking to end the fight quickly, to minimize the slaughter of innocents. But this was war, and war was never clean. By dusk, the Yunkish lines had dissolved, many surrendering or fleeing. Meereen's gates stood battered but unbroken. Smoke drifted across the battlefield. Daenerys flew overhead on Drogon's back, a figure of myth and legend, silver hair streaming in the wind, face set in grim triumph. Arthur watched her land beyond the gates, where the freedmen cheered her with cries of Mysa. Even in the exhaustion of victory, he felt a surge of admiration. Here was a queen who had not flinched from battle, who fought for her people rather than send them to die for her. A far cry from the Mad King or from other petty tyrants he had known. In the aftermath, Daenerys offered clemency to those who would lay down arms and recognize her rule. Many did. Some of the old slaver families would never yield, but their power was broken for the moment. Meereen celebrated cautiously, aware that the war was not truly over, but at least for a time, the threat had receded. That night, Daenerys held court in the throne room. Freedmen sang songs of victory. Dario boasted about slicing through Yunkish lines. Barristan quietly offered his counsel on how to secure the city's defenses. Arthur stood at Daenerys' side, content to observe. She looked radiant, though streaks of soot smudged her arms, and her hair was singed in places from the dragonfire, the price of riding a living furnace. Yet her eyes shone with fierce determination, tempered by sorrow for the lives lost. She caught Arthur's gaze and beckoned him closer. "Sir Arthur, you have served me well today. Your command on the walls helped hold the city. You fought bravely." He bowed. "It is my duty, your grace. I am honored to serve." She studied him for a moment, then lowered her voice so only he could hear. "Tell me truly, would Rhaegar have approved of all this? The dragons, the battles, the freeing of slaves?" Arthur paused, thinking of the prince he had known. Prince Rhaegar despised needless cruelty. I believe he would have supported any effort to end slavery, to protect the innocent. He was a good man, despite what the realm might remember of his final choices. I think he would have admired your strength, your grace. A flicker of sadness crossed her face. I wish I could have known him, but I am glad that you did, that you carry a piece of him here. She laid a hand on his arm, a simple gesture of trust. Thank you, Sir Arthur. Tomorrow we plan for the next steps. We cannot stay in Meereen forever, not when Westeros awaits. But I must first secure peace in Slaver's Bay. Arthur bowed again, feeling a quiet sense of reverence. Whatever path you choose, your grace, my sword is yours. She withdrew her hand and turned back to the court, accepting the accolades of her freedmen. Arthur stepped back, letting the swirl of celebration surround her. He recalled how he had once knelt to Rhaegar, pledging his life to preserve the Targaryen line. He had failed, dying at the Tower of Joy. Now, in this second life, he had found a Targaryen worthy of that pledge, forging a new destiny in a distant land. He wondered if the Red Priest's prophecy would truly lead them to some final war against the darkness. If so, he would stand at Daenerys' side, a living blade resurrected from the ashes of history, ready to defend the dawn against the long night. And for the first time since his awakening, Arthur Dayne felt something akin to hope, a fragile spark in the midst of war and upheaval. This time, perhaps, the Targaryen cause would not crumble. Perhaps this time, The dawn would break over a realm free from tyranny. And if that hope required all of him, his life, his very soul, he would give it gladly. For such was the vow he had made, in life and beyond death, to the blood of the dragon. In the weeks following the victory over the Yunkish host, the city of Meereen remained in a precarious state. Smoke still drifted from scorched rooftops where firebombs had fallen during the siege, and though the besiegers had retreated or laid down arms, rumors persisted that fresh coalitions might form. Daenerys Targaryen oversaw the work of clearing rubble from the streets, issuing orders to feed the hungry and tend to the wounded. Arthur Dayne, newly accepted into her service, moved through the city like a watchful ghost, prepared to respond should violence erupt anew. He found himself stepping into a role not unlike the one he had once held in the Kingsguard, a protector who led by example. Though Daenerys had formed no official Queensguard, Arthur and Ser Barristan Selmy functioned much like her chief knights, each carrying a wealth of experience from Westeros. Some called Ser Barristan Barristan the Bold, while others whispered that Arthur was some sort of revenant, a man claimed by death and then spared by R'hllor. Rarely did he speak of that event, for his second life was a mystery even to him, and he preferred not to invite more scrutiny. In the early mornings, Arthur drilled with the Unsullied in the plaza before the Great Pyramid. Grey Worm commanded them with unwavering discipline, and though Arthur was well versed in swordcraft, he found their cohesive maneuvers both impressive and eerie. Their utter lack of fear or hesitation could turn a battle's tide, but it also served as a reminder of how inhuman war could be. At least now they fought for a leader they believed in, Daenerys Stormborn, the breaker of chains, who had freed them from bondage. When the day's training ended, Arthur often supervised smaller groups of newly freed men and women who sought to hone their skills. These former slaves, some still bearing the scars of whips, faced him with fierce resolve. They had endured the worst of the old order and refused to be caught unprepared again. Arthur demonstrated how to hold a shield properly, how to pivot aside rather than meet a charging foe head-on, how to angle a sword for a swift kill. He stressed discipline over brute force. He knew Daenerys wished to spare as many lives as possible, but he also knew from long experience that their enemies would show no pity. Tension weighed heavily on the city. The Sons of the Harpy had not vanished with the Yunkish retreat. At night, they continued a campaign of terror, slitting throats in dark alleys or setting ambushes against the Unsullied. More than once, Arthur and Barristan joined patrols trying to flush them out. They proved elusive, slipping into hidden passageways or bribing some among the impoverished to hide them. Arthur saw the aftermath of their cruelty. Freedmen left with throats cut, unsullied bodies sprawled in gutters. Each horror steeled his determination. Daenerys held court daily in the Great Pyramid, hearing petitions from the freedmen, the old noble families, and visiting envoys from nearby cities. She appeared tireless, though Arthur could see the strain. By evening, she would retreat to her private chambers, face worn, to consult with Missandei or Barristan. Sometimes she sought Arthur out for his perspective, especially when the petitions touched on Westeros. "Did your king, my brother, ever imagine he would deal with matters like these?" she asked one evening, gesturing to parchment lists of local grievances. Rhaegar was known as a thoughtful man, but I doubt he ever pictured contending with slaver politics and constant uprisings. Arthur answered carefully. Rhaegar believed in prophecy, in a savior who might unite the realm. But no, I don't think he imagined fighting a hidden war against masked killers in a foreign city. Still, he was determined to protect common folk in his own way. You share that same concern. Do not lose heart because these challenges feel alien. Daenerys sighed. I want to bring peace to these people. I freed them from slavery, but they remain trapped by old hatreds. The Sons of the Harpy can't see beyond their lost glory. I've tried mercy, but each day we pay for it in blood. Arthur rested a hand on the table, an earnest gesture that conveyed both loyalty and concern. Mercy is never truly wasted, even if it appears so. It shows those who watch that you are different from the lords who ruled by fear. But perhaps a firmer hand is needed for those who refuse to put down teach. Knife. She studied him. A firmer hand, I know, but I won't let this city turn me into my father. In the days that followed, Daenerys enacted new measures designed to unify Meereen. One of the most contentious decisions was to reopen the fighting pits, at the urging of the old families who insisted that the spectacles would placate the populace. Many freedmen detested the idea, seeing it as a return to the brutality of the past. But Daenerys, trying to keep the peace, agreed with heavy reluctance, stipulating that only free fighters could participate. Arthur watched anxiously, aware that Daenerys despised such blood sport. Perhaps it was a necessary evil, or so her counselors argued. Meanwhile, a new arrival shook the court. Quentyn Martell, a prince of Dorne, had come to propose a marriage alliance. Word spread that he bore a secret pact binding Dorne to House Targaryen, should Daenerys accept him as consort and commit to retaking Westeros. Arthur recalled House Martell well, having served Princess Elia when Rhaegar still lived. The notion that Dorne remembered old ties intrigued him. Quentyn was no flamboyant warrior like Oberyn Martell, but an earnest, dutiful figure who seemed determined to honor his family's hidden oath. Daenerys did not spurn him outright, nor did she embrace the proposal. She thanked him for Dorne's remembrance of her bloodline, promising only to consider his offer. Quentyn lingered near the Great Pyramid, trying to win her favor or at least gain a sense of her plans. Barristan favored an alliance with Dorne, citing old loyalties. Daario Naharis was more skeptical, preferring that Daenerys consolidate her authority in Slaver's Bay first. Grey Worm had no opinion on Westerosi politics, focusing instead on daily city security. Still, the city seethed. The Sons of the Harpy grew bolder, launching a coordinated attack one night. Arthur stood the night watch on the walls when he saw flickering torches in the labyrinth of streets. Shouts echoed, and he rushed below with a squad of freedmen, meeting Grey Worm and a detachment of Unsullied along the way. Barristan Selmy followed from within the pyramid. They found multiple flashpoints of violence. Masked men surrounding small groups of freedmen, Unsullied pinned inside alleys, local folks screaming and fleeing. Arthur's borrowed sword, though no dawn, proved deadly enough. He cut down a harpy mask that lunged at him with twin daggers. Freedmen and Unsullied fought side by side in swirling chaos. By dawn, they had killed or captured 24 sons, but dozens of freedmen lay dead in the streets, along with several Unsullied. Daenerys surveyed the bodies from a balcony at sunrise, face ashen. Arthur stood beside her, silent, his tunic stained with blood from the fighting. "This city devours itself," Daenerys whispered, voice trembling with suppressed rage. "All I've done, and they still seek to murder those I freed." Arthur lowered his gaze. "They fear losing their power. Hatred doesn't vanish overnight, but you have given hope to the innocent, and that hope drives them." She exhaled slowly, turning away from the ghastly sight. "But how many more must die? Enough. Perhaps it's time the old families truly feared me." A flurry of decisions followed. Daenerys ordered the infiltration of noble houses rumored to support the Sons of the Harpy. Suspected conspirators were taken in for questioning. She allowed the fighting pits to open, hoping, however grimly, to placate a portion of the city. Arthur disagreed with the spectacle but recognized the Queen's predicament. The freedmen fumed. Tension built toward the fateful day when Meereen's greatest fighting pit would host its first matches under Daenerys's partial blessing. On the appointed day, thousands crowded the arena, cheering or jeering as fighters entered the sandy floor. Daenerys sat in a special box high above, flanked by Arthur and Barristan. Daario, Grey Worm, and a cadre of Unsullied stood in the shadows behind her. Sunlight pounded the arena, reflecting off weapons. Arthur glanced at Daenerys. She watched each match with a steely resignation, looking away from time to time when a fatal blow fell. At first, the day seemed to pass uneventfully, albeit soaked in blood. Then, as two new fighters squared off, a commotion erupted in the stands. Arthur spotted masked shapes among the spectators. The Sons of the Harpy, biding their time, now struck. Screams tore through the arena as they plunged knives into Unsullied stationed nearby. Panic spread, with many in the crowd trampling one another to flee. Arthur sprang to Daenerys' side, sword in hand. Barristan shouted orders to secure the queen and dispatch additional forces. Daenerys, incensed, told them to protect the people. Arthur and Barristan hesitated. Her safety was paramount, but so was saving innocent lives. Finally, Barristan rushed off, leading a squad to the stands, while Arthur formed a wedge around Daenerys to escort her away. Down a corridor behind the royal box, masked assassins emerged. Arthur parried the thrust of one, his blade ringing against the attacker's steel. He countered swiftly, driving his sword beneath the man's ribs. Another assassin lunged from the side, only to be cut down by Dario. Daenerys stood behind them, face pale but unflinching. They pushed through a door leading deeper under the arena, accompanied by Grey Worm and a few Unsullied. Beneath the fighting pit, dimly lit tunnels opened into storage rooms and holding cells for fighters. The passage reeked of sweat and old blood. Arthur noted bodies, Unsullied, sons of the Harpy, even pit fighters, strewn across the corridor. A distant roar echoed, shaking the stone walls. For a moment, Arthur thought it was the roar of the crowd. Then he recognized something far more powerful. Drogon. He knows? Daenerys murmured, voice edged with awe and fear. He senses I'm in danger. Dario looked alarmed. If the dragon comes here, he might burn half the city. They pressed on. More sons materialized, but the Unsullied led by Grey Worm fought a savage defense. Arthur dispatched one more masked attacker, cutting off a cry of "Harpy!" The group finally reached a wooden door that opened onto a small platform above the pit's lower tiers. The scene was chaos. Fires burned where Drogon had already unleashed flames, and masked killers clashed with Unsullied on the terraces. The crowd attempted to flee, only to bottleneck at the exits. A man in the stands shrieked as Drogon soared overhead, black wings blotting out the sky. Terrified people scattered, many as fearful of the dragon as of the masked assassins. Daenerys rushed forward onto the platform, ignoring Dario's warning. Drogon swooped low, setting a portion of the stands ablaze. The heat of the dragonfire slammed against Arthur like a hot wind, forcing him to shield his face. Beneath the fire's roar, Daenerys stepped into the open, her silver-gold hair blowing in the furnace-like gust. Arthur watched in terrified wonder as Drogon, bellowing in rage, descended to her. He tore into the wooden structure with his claws, wings thrashing. Sparks and embers swirled. Daenerys lifted a trembling hand, speaking soft words of Valyrian lost in the din. Drogon raged, snapping at the air, uncertain. Then, slowly, the beast lowered its head, allowing her to rest a hand upon its scales. Dario started to lunge forward, but Grey Worm held him back, fearing to startle the dragon. Before any could react further, Daenerys climbed onto Drogon's back, grasping a ridge of black spikes. With a colossal surge, Drogon launched skyward, scattering broken timbers and smoke. She vanished above the arena's high walls, leaving Meereen to the chaos below. Arthur felt a pang in his chest. The queen had flown. Where she might land, no one could say. In the following hours, the sons of the Harpy withdrew, having done their damage. Fires smoldered, and the stands lay strewn with corpses. Freedmen huddled near the gates, and soldiers helped the wounded. Meereen was leaderless, its queen borne away on a dragon's back, her fate unknown. Barristan Selmy, bloodied but alive, rallied what remained of the city's defenses. Arthur assisted him, both men haunted by the possibility that Daenerys might be dead or lost. Days blurred into a tense limbo. No sign of Daenerys, no sightings of Drogon. The city panicked. Freedmen feared the slavers would pounce now that the queen was gone. Indeed, word arrived that the Yunkish had begun regrouping, forming yet another alliance to retake Meereen. Barristan set up a provisional rule, forming a council of freedmen, Unsullied, and any old family members willing to stand for peace. Arthur lent his sword where needed, patrolling the streets, quelling riots, and watching for the sons of the Harpy. Rumors proliferated. Some claimed Daenerys had perished in the desert. Others said she had flown to Karth or Volantis. Meanwhile, Quentyn Martell, desperate to prove his worth, attempted a mad plan to tame one of the captive dragons beneath the pyramid. Arthur heard the alarms too late to stop the tragedy. Quentin and his companions entered the catacombs with ropes and chains, only for Regal and Viserion to break free, incinerating them in a wave of dragonfire. Arthur arrived to find the tunnel ablaze, Martell's body charred. The dragons burst out into the night sky, unbound and furious. Now all three were gone, and Myrine stood on the brink of ruin. Outside the city, a new siege began. Yunkai and its allies encircled Myrine with a vast host of sellswords, local levies, and slave soldiers. The freedmen faced hunger and bombardment by siege engines. Disease threatened from tainted water. Arthur and Barristan conferred daily, debating whether to sally forth. Dario wanted to ride out and crush the foe. Grey Worm suggested holding the walls. Arthur advised caution. While his experience in Westeros was considerable, this was Essos, where armies could be enormous and alliances fickle. So they waited, pinned behind the walls. Flaming projectiles rained down at night, setting fire to granaries and rooftops. Arthur fought to maintain hope among the freedmen, reminding them that Daenerys had vowed never to abandon them. But the weeks ground on and morale flagged. Refugees from the countryside flooded in, straining the city's resources. The Sons of the Harpy bided their time, occasionally striking to deepen despair. Then came a horn's blare at dawn. Arthur, dozing atop the ramparts, jerked awake. Soldiers pointed west. A great plume of dust rose, and a thunderous sound of hooves carried on the wind. The watchman shouted a single word that resounded along the walls. Dothraki! An immense horde galloped across the plain. The Yunkish lines hurried to form up, but confusion reigned. Overhead, a dark shape with massive wings soared, Drogon, roaring his challenge. Arthur felt a jolt of wild elation. He scrambled down the steps, rallying freedmen and Unsullied. Barristan joined him, face lit with a grim smile. The gates opened, and they poured out to take advantage of the enemy's sudden panic. Drogon swooped low, blasting the siege engines with dragonfire. The Dothraki riders, led by Daenerys Targaryen astride a white horse, slammed into the Yunkish flank. Curved rocks flashed in the morning sun. Slaver lines wavered, sellsword companies scrambled. Some changed sides immediately, refusing to face a dragon in open battle. Arthur led a wedge of freedmen into the fray, slicing through disoriented spearmen. Grey Worm, with the Unsullied, advanced methodically in tight formation, unstoppable. The clang of steel and the screams of men filled the air. Overhead, Drogon continued to strafe, setting entire swaths of the battlefield aflame. By midday, the Yunkish lines had collapsed. Many surrendered, others fled in disarray. Daenerys guided her horse through the battered gates to a rapturous welcome. Freedmen shouted Mysa, while Unsullied slammed their spears in salute. Arthur dismounted to greet her, heart thrumming with relief. She rode in, hair tangled by the wind, face smeared with dust. Yet she radiated strength more powerfully than ever, surviving not only the fighting pits but a journey into the Dothraki Sea, where she had apparently gathered a new Khalasar to her side. "I will not leave you again," she proclaimed to her people as she re-entered the Great Pyramid. "Myrine is ours, and we will defend it. The slavers are broken this day, and so they shall remain." She ordered the city's defenses reinforced and the Yunkish leaders dragged before her in chains. Arthur stood by as these men, once so threatening, quaked in terror beneath the shadow of Drogon perched on a high parapet. She forced them to relinquish any hold on slavery, compelled them to sign new treaties promising freedom for all in their domains. With the might of the Dothraki and the dragons behind her, most complied. The freedmen cheered. The city erupted in celebrations. Barristan oversaw the partial disarming of prisoner camps, while Arthur helped reorganize the freedmen's militia, ensuring that Myrine would not so easily be shaken again. In calmer moments, Daenerys and her close advisors gathered in the pyramid's audience chamber, discussing the future. Quentyn Martell was dead, but his mission hinted at the possibility that Dorne might still support a Targaryen restoration in Westeros. The queen considered her next steps carefully. The conflict in Slaver's Bay, though subdued for now, might flare again if she left. Yet Westeros beckoned. She did not forget her true claim or the realm that had cast her family aside. She conferred with Arthur and Barristan, gleaning every detail of the Seven Kingdoms, the great houses, the alliances, the likely reception to a Targaryen return. One evening, Daenerys called a private meeting in a small side hall. Barristan, Arthur, Grey Worm, and Daario attended, along with Missandei. Torchlight flickered on stone walls, and the hush of the courtyard below offered some semblance of peace after months of turmoil. Daenerys addressed them softly. "We must sail for Westeros. This city cannot consume my entire reign. If I do not press my claim, the Iron Throne remains in the hands of usurpers, and Westeros may never see the freedom I have promised these people. But I cannot abandon Slaver's Bay to collapse the moment I depart." Barristan inclined his head. "I stand ready to advise you in the Seven Kingdoms, Your Grace. But yes, we must leave a stable government here." Daario frowned. "You would leave Meereen in other hands? We just fought to keep it from falling apart. Who will protect it if not you?" Daenerys's gaze flicked to him. "Someone I trust. That is why I would like you, Daario, to remain behind. Lead a council of freedmen and keep the peace. Missandei, if you would stay, you can guide negotiations, interpret for the people. You know the local tongues better than any of us." Missandei bowed her head, tears forming in her eyes. She was unerringly loyal to Daenerys, but she knew it would be the best way to protect the city. Daario bit his lip, struggling with frustration, but nodded after a moment. "If it is your will, I will do as you command, my queen." Daenerys turned to Grey Worm. "I will not order the Unsullied to stay if they wish to go with me. They followed me from Astapor to here. They are free. They may choose." Grey Worm squared his shoulders. "We swore to follow you, blood of my blood. The Unsullied march where you lead." A soft sigh escaped Daenerys. "Then so be it. Ser Barristan, Ser Arthur, will you come with me? I need your counsel and your swords in the land of my birth." Arthur bowed low. "We are yours to command. Westeros is your right, and I for one would see a Targaryen upon the Iron Throne if you can bring justice to the realm." Barristan placed a hand over his heart. "I pledged my life to House Targaryen long ago. Let us see this through, Your Grace." In the ensuing weeks, preparations accelerated. Daenerys used wealth seized from the slavers to purchase ships. She commissioned new vessels as well, though time was limited. The city bustled with shipwrights, merchants, and freedmen, all eager or anxious about the queen's impending departure. Envoys from the other freed cities arrived, trying to secure their own positions or trade benefits. Arthur spent his days organizing the freedmen militia, explaining that some would sail west if they wished, while others could remain to maintain order under Daario's counsel. Rhaegal and Viserion eventually returned to Meereen, drawn by Drogon's presence, their roars echoing across the city's rooftops at dawn and dusk. Daenerys prepared a formal farewell. In a massive assembly held in the throne room, freedmen leaders, old noble houses, and her closest advisors gathered. She announced she would leave Meereen in the hands of those who had proven their loyalty and would not permit slavery to rise again. Daario and Missandei accepted her charge before the throngs, who greeted the news with a mix of sadness and celebration. Despite lingering fears, many freedmen trusted Daenerys to keep her vow that she would not abandon them entirely. Some volunteered to accompany her, seeing it as a chance to fight for her cause across the sea. When the day came, the harbor teemed with ships and people. The stench of fish mingled with the sweat of countless bodies. Dothraki riders eyed the vessels warily, many having never set foot on a deck. Unsullied marched in disciplined ranks, boarding galleys, while freedmen carried crates of provisions. The cry of seagulls mingled with the snorting of horses and the barked orders of captains. Daario and Missandei followed Daenerys to the docks, the final farewell on their faces. Arthur stood nearby, shielded by a simple breastplate and armed with a well-honed sword. Dawn, the ancestral blade of House Dayne, remained somewhere in Westeros with his kin. but if ever it were within reach, perhaps he would claim it again. For now, he carried steel that served him well enough. He watched as Daenerys hugged Missandei, who tried valiantly not to sob. Daario dipped his head in respect, lips pressed thin. Then they stepped back, letting Daenerys pass into the boat that would carry her to the flagship. The crowd cheered as she embarked. "Misa!" rose from hundreds of throats. Children waved strips of cloth. Some freedmen knelt, tears streaming down their cheeks. Daenerys gazed at them, her expression solemn, then raised a hand in silent benediction. Arthur followed her onto the deck of the largest vessel. Grey Worm and the Unsullied formed a protective ring, while Barristan murmured instructions to a ship's officer. With a groan of ropes and a creak of timbers, the flagship pulled away from the pier. The rest of the armada followed, sails catching the breeze. On the docks, a sea of faces watched them depart, hopes pinned on the queen who had delivered them from chains. High above, Drogon circled, letting out a roar that echoed over the harbor. Rhaegal and Viserion flanked him, the three dragons weaving through the sky like living omens. Daenerys stood at the prow, looking west across the sea's vast expanse. Arthur joined her. The wind tugged at her silver-gold braids, her eyes reflecting a fierce determination and a flicker of doubt. She turned to him. "Ser Arthur," she said quietly, so that only he and Barristan, who stood nearby, might hear. "Westeros will be a greater challenge than any we've faced here. Lords and ladies who still whisper about the Mad King, a country battered by wars of succession, rumors of an undead threat in the far north. Rhaegar believed in a prophecy. I don't know if I share his faith, but I do know I must try to. Oh, save them, from themselves if nothing else." Arthur knelt to one knee, bowing his head. "Where you lead, I follow. If the Seven Kingdoms scorn you, we will remind them why House Targaryen once united dragons and men. And if there is indeed a darkness gathering beyond the wall, we will face it together." Barristan laid a hand gently on Daenerys' shoulder. "You carry not just the name Targaryen, but the hopes of all who believe in a fairer world. I served your father, but I serve you now with all my heart." Daenerys placed her hand over Barristan's and offered Arthur a resolute nod. Then she stepped forward, turning her face to the wind. Behind them, the freedmen volunteers found spots on the deck, and the Dothraki eyed the rolling waves with trepidation. The dragons soared overhead, watchful guardians of the fleet. Already, Meereen's towers faded on the horizon, a memory of bloodshed and triumph. Arthur gripped the rail, gazing at the receding shore. So much had happened since the day he had awakened in that damp cave. His life restored by Lawlor's servants. He thought of the final moments he remembered before death. The Tower of Joy, the clash with Ned Stark, the hush of a dawn that came too late to save Rhaegar. Now he stood at the edge of another dawn, one that might deliver a queen he believed worthy of the Iron Throne and beyond. The great war of ice and fire that the Red Priests had prophesied might soon test them all. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the salt wind fill his lungs. Somewhere, across the waves, Westeros awaited. A realm of heartbreak and promise, once his homeland, now a land that believed him long dead. Unseen forces moved in the north. Legends of the White Walkers whispered in hushed tones. Daenerys Targaryen, the last scion of a fallen dynasty, carried the might of dragons. Arthur Dayne, reborn to protect her, would play his part, whatever fate demanded. As the ship carved its path westward, the entire fleet following, the sun climbed higher, scattering gold on the water. Daenerys rested her hands on the prow, eyes set on a future no one could fully glimpse. Arthur stood at her side like a silent sentinel, ready for whatever storms lay beyond the horizon. If the world required a champion for Dawn's light, he would be there, blade in hand, defending the queen who might just be that light made flesh. And though he could not see the shape of the battles to come, he felt a fierce certainty. The dawn was rising again for House Targaryen, and this time he would not fail his oath, no matter the cost. Arthur Dayne stood on the wind-swept deck of the flagship, one hand on the railing as the coast of Essos faded from view. Gull cries mingled with the rhythmic snap of sails overhead, while the salt wind tugged at the hair that fell around his temples. Ahead stretched the great expanse of the sunset sea, marked here and there by the silhouettes of escort ships carrying the Dothraki, freedmen, and Unsullied, all sailing westward under Queen Daenerys Targaryen's banner. He cast a glance toward her at the prow. She stood tall, arms folded, silver-gold braids stirring in the ocean breeze. Ser Barristan Selmy had retired below deck to confer with the ship's captain. Grey Worm was elsewhere, arranging quarters for the Unsullied. And Daenerys, for a moment, was alone with her thoughts. Arthur's long strides carried him across the swaying timbers until he came to stand a few respectful paces behind her. She sensed his presence. He could see the tension in her neck ease slightly, as though comforted by a familiar ally. The queen did not turn. Her gaze stretched outward, across the waves. "The sea is never ending," she said softly. "I look, and all I see is distance. I used to think this crossing would be simpler, a brief matter of charting a course, then a triumphant return to the land of my birth. But it feels so vast." Arthur allowed the hush of the wind to linger before speaking. "Crossing great distances always does. I recall sailing from King's Landing to Dragonstone long ago. The sea can be relentless, yet we endure." A small nod. She turned partially so he could see her profile. "We have so many with us now. Dothraki who have never set foot on a ship. Freedmen who pledged to follow me anywhere. The Unsullied. And you, Ser Arthur, who have literally come back from the grave. I wonder, does that not weigh on you?" He exhaled, remembering the cold emptiness of that dark cave under the watch of red priests. His trembling resurrection. Even now it felt surreal. "At times it does, Your Grace. Yet I remind myself there must be a purpose to it. To return after death cannot be mere chance." "That is exactly what I believe," she said, turning fully to face him now. "The Lord of Light revived you for some reason, perhaps to safeguard this mission, to help restore the Targaryen dynasty, or to fight the threat many whisper about in the north. We both have destinies shaped by forces we don't entirely control." Arthur inclined his head. "Perhaps. All I know is that when I served your brother, I believed in the promise of a better realm, one free from cruelty and wanton tyranny. I see that promise in you, Your Grace. Whatever war we face, I will stand at your side." She regarded him steadily, her violet eyes gleaming with the reflection of midday sun. "Thank you, Ser Arthur." A horn blast echoed from a nearby vessel, signaling that the armada was forming tighter ranks. Daenerys gave him a final nod and moved off along the deck to speak with some Dothraki bloodriders who were eyeing the horizon with apprehension. Arthur lingered, letting the conversation settle over him. The conviction she carried resonated in him like a half-forgotten vow. In life, he had followed Rhaegar Targaryen. In death renewed, he would follow Daenerys. The next few days on the narrow sea proved relatively calm. The Queen's growing fleet included newly built galleys purchased with the spoils of war, as well as confiscated slaver ships. Some of the Dothraki adapted poorly, unsettled by the sense of being adrift on an endless expanse of water. Their horses needed constant attention, and more than once, a skittish stallion threatened to plunge off the ramps. Arthur made it part of his daily routine to check on the ships carrying the largest number of Dothraki and freedmen, ensuring that morale did not plummet. He spoke patiently when language allowed, or used gestures otherwise, mindful of the bond that formed when one calm presence offered reassurance. He kept a close watch on the sky, too. Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion spent their time either circling the fleet in wide loops or soaring ahead to scout. Occasionally, they vanished entirely for a day, returning at dusk to roost on the tallest masts or on small islets that dotted the sea route. Their presence was as vital for Daenerys' image as it was for reconnaissance, though the dragons had caused panic in more than one unsuspecting merchant vessel that strayed too near. One late afternoon, Barristan invited Arthur to share a simple meal in the ship's cramped cabin. They spoke over bowls of salted fish stew, the tang of brine never far from their nostrils. Candlelight flickered on the walls. Barristan's lined features looked weary yet determined. "How fares our queen from your vantage?" the older knight asked, sipping water from a tin cup. She shoulders a heavy burden. I've observed her from the time she was scarcely more than a girl, trusting in the few she had around her. Now she commands a host of thousands and aims to conquer a kingdom that hardly remembers her father's reign fondly. Arthur nodded, setting down his spoon. She has doubts, no question, but also the resolve that you used to speak of in Prince Rhaegar. A sense that the realm deserves more than the petty squabbles of feuding lords. And she's seen enough horrors to know she can't allow them to fester. Barristan leaned forward, voice lowered even in the relative privacy of the cabin. Yes, but forging alliances in Westeros will not be as straightforward as in Slaver's Bay. The lords might greet her with suspicion. They remember the Mad King's cruelties, and Robert Baratheon's rebellion ended with a Targaryen exile. Many are proud, stubborn. If we want them to bend the knee willingly, we must tread carefully. Arthur pressed his lips together. I fear open war might break out if she's challenged. Dragons can be persuasive, but fear alone won't keep a realm together. She'll need a measure of trust. Allies, perhaps House Martell in Dorne might rally to her cause. The Tyrells, too, if they bear grudges against the throne. We must see how the land lies. Barristan nodded gravely. It's been many years since I was forced to flee King's Landing. Much will have changed. But if the rumors are correct, Cersei Lannister holds the Iron Throne now. Tommen is gone, as I hear the Boy King died in the aftermath of the High Sparrow's downfall. Cersei is no friend to Mercy, nor to Targaryens. Arthur's thoughts flicked to the day Rhaegar died on the Trident, and how that single event had shattered the Targaryen line. Then we must brace for conflict. I only hope there are still Lords of Honor in Westeros, men like Eddard Stark once was. Barristan's face clouded at the mention of Ned Stark. A good man. Hard to imagine how the realm has gone so awry. But let us have faith. They finished the meal in pensive silence, the timbers creaking around them. Outside, the wind picked up, and the deckhands' voices drifted through the narrow windows. This was a quiet vigil before the storm. Within a fortnight, the first outlines of the Westerosi coast appeared against an overcast sky. Craggy cliffs, ominous in the dull light, with gulls wheeling overhead. Daenerys ordered the fleet to steer for Dragonstone, the ancient seat of House Targaryen. Barristan had counseled that it was the most logical foothold, a fortress of strategic value, left lightly garrisoned if rumors proved true. From there, they could plan. And so the flagship led the armada around dangerous shoals until the dark shape of Dragonstone's citadel rose into view. Towers shaped like dragons' necks, a foreboding silhouette perched on a basalt island. Rain greeted their approach, a thin drizzle that slicked every surface. Arthur stood by Daenerys at the ship's prow, watching waves break against rocks. The fortress loomed tall, black stone pitted by centuries of storms. He recalled fleeting glimpses of it in his youth, back when Prince Rhaegar would sometimes speak of the seat once held by House Targaryen before the rebellion. Felt surreal to see it again, an echo of ghosts. As they drew near, no catapults fired, no archers rained arrows. The fortress stood silent, seemingly abandoned. Daenerys signaled the other ships to hold position while a handful of smaller boats rowed to the docks. Arthur accompanied her, along with Grey Worm and a small detachment of Unsullied. They moved slowly across the worn black stones of the quay, cautious. The wind keened, throwing sheets of briny spray. Barristan had remained back on the flagship to oversee the fleet's anchoring. Crenellated walls rose ahead. A single iron gate stood ajar, rust staining its edges. Inside the courtyard, the only sound was the shuffle of feet on wet ground. No banners flew. Grey Worm gestured for the Unsullied to spread out and secure the area. After several tense moments, it became clear that the fortress was indeed empty, or nearly so. They found a few half-finished meals in the Great Hall, as though the inhabitants had fled in haste or been forced out. The hearth lay cold, ashes scattered. Higher up, in the tower chambers, more signs of abrupt departure. Scattered papers, a turned-over bench, an empty armory rack. Whomever had garrisoned Dragonstone had chosen to leave upon hearing rumors of dragons or approaching ships, or perhaps for reasons unknown. Daenerys surveyed the grand hall with a measured calm. Giant pillars carved into the shapes of dragons' talons lined the walls, each one black as night. A sense of history pressed down like a physical weight. Once, Aegon the Conqueror had built his base upon this rock. Now Daenerys, the last of his line, stood in its halls again. Arthur watched her expression shift from solemn wonder to a quiet determination. "Secure the fortress," she said at last, turning to Grey Worm. "We need to ensure no hidden foes remain. Then we'll land the bulk of our forces. Let the fleet anchor in the deeper waters and ferry men and supplies to shore. Dragonstone will be our first foothold." Grey Worm saluted, dispatching scouts and squads. Daenerys beckoned Arthur to follow her up a twisting stairwell. Torches set in iron brackets lit the path. They emerged on a wide battlement, from which they could see the ocean's sweep and the silhouette of the anchored ships. In the distance, beyond the churning waves, the faint coastline of mainland Westeros beckoned. It was a bleak, rain-swept scene, but a stirring one. The Targaryen queen returned to her blood's seat. Arthur stepped to the parapet's edge, scanning for any sign of Lannister banners or enemy sail. He saw none. Seabirds cawed. Wind rattled the old iron braziers. Daenerys approached, resting a gloved hand on the ancient stone. She inhaled, as though drawing the salt air deep into her lungs. "Here we are," she murmured, "on the threshold of Westeros. A part of me never thought I'd see these shores, yet here I stand." Arthur inclined his head. "Your forebears built their power from this island. You continue that legacy. Only this time, perhaps it shall be forged with the knowledge gleaned from your trials in the East." She lifted her chin. "I intend no war of mass devastation. No families will burn in their halls if they bend the knee. But the realm must be united under just rule. I won't suffer tyrants." Her words carried an edge of iron. Arthur wondered if the lords of Westeros would see the difference between her brand of strength and her father's madness. He hoped so. There will be those who fear dragons or resent the Targaryen name. We'll need to show them we come with more than fire and blood. You did so in Meereen, freeing the oppressed, punishing the cruel. It can be done again. She smiled faintly, then laid a hand on his arm. "Thank you for believing that. I'll rely on your counsel, Ser Arthur." Together, they gazed across the sea, letting the moment crystallize. This was the threshold, indeed. The fortress was under their control, no banners of resistance in sight. But the realm beyond seethed with politics and agendas, shaped by wars Daenerys had never witnessed. The next step in her journey would be forging alliances or subduing enemies. Likely both. Within a day, a steady stream of small boats ferried Dothraki, Unsullied, and freedmen volunteers to the Dragonstone docks. Barrels of grain, casks of water, fresh supplies all arrived in the courtyard. Barristan Selmy took charge of organizing the Queen's forces around the fortress, overseeing the arrangement of a makeshift camp for those who would not fit in the main keep. Daenerys established her seat in the ancient hall, where once Stannis Baratheon had plotted his doomed rebellions. Strange carvings of sea dragons and leviathans lined the walls, but she paid them little heed. In the weeks that followed, they scoured the fortress from top to bottom. Arthur, leading small detachments, found hidden chambers containing old scrolls, dusty relics, and the remnants of alchemical labs. More importantly, they uncovered a supply of dragonglass beneath the castle, a storied substance prized by the first men and rumored to harm the White Walkers. Barristan recalled legends that Stannis Baratheon had known of its importance, though the reason was uncertain. Daenerys, hearing that this black volcanic glass was death to the creatures of the long night, insisted on storing it carefully. Arthur found himself recalling the Red Priest's warnings of a war of ice and fire. This find could be no coincidence. As they settled into a tense routine, Daenerys sent ravens to the great houses of Westeros, proclaiming her return and inviting them to pledge loyalty. The letters emphasized her birthright, her dragons, and her desire to bring justice and stability. A portion of the messages also conveyed a warning that a greater threat loomed in the north, one that only a united realm could oppose. Whether the lords would heed such tidings remained to be seen. Months earlier, Quentyn Martell had died trying to claim a dragon. The news had reached Dorne, no doubt, and so Daenerys penned a personal appeal to Prince Doran, expressing regret for Quentyn's tragic choice but offering alliance and a shared cause. Barristan wrote to old friends in the Stormlands and the Reach, those who might recall the better days of Targaryen leadership. Even Arthur Dayne dared to pen a note to Starfall, the seat of his own house Dayne, explaining that he lived again, though he knew how implausible it would seem. "All we can do now is wait," Daenerys said grimly one evening, pacing the black stone of the castle's war room. A great table carved in the shape of Westeros dominated the space, an artifact from Aegon's conquest. Candles burned low, illuminating carved coastlines and miniature keeps representing the major strongholds. She paused over a carved wolf's head marking the north, then drifted past a rose for Highgarden and a lion for Casterly Rock. Arthur, standing across the table, admired how the candlelight highlighted the silver in her hair. "And plan for the worst in case no one responds," he added. Dario Naharis was no longer with them. He had remained in Meereen, but Grey Worm stood behind her. The unsullied commander was stoic as ever, unreadable. Barristan, to Arthur's left, folded his hands behind his back. "We can't linger forever without action. The realm will see us as a distant threat or rumor if we don't show our strength. At the same time, we must not appear as invaders bringing only destruction." Daenerys nodded. "We will be strategic. If a house declares for us, we'll defend them if they face reprisals from King's Landing. If none do, we must still press forward. But let's see what word arrives." It arrived sooner than they expected. Within a fortnight, ravens returned bearing varied responses. Some, from minor lords near the Stormlands, expressed polite neutrality or fear, reluctant to commit. One letter from the Reach, sealed with Lady Olenna Tyrell's sigil, offered scathing words about Cersei Lannister and a cautious willingness to meet if Daenerys proved her sincerity. Another letter, from Prince Doran in Dorne, was guarded but indicated the Martells would consider an alliance in memory of Elia and Quentyn, provided the Queen disavowed any role in Quentyn's death. And from the north, no raven arrived at all, an unsettling silence. But the most urgent reply was not a letter at all. A single battered ship slipped into the waters near Dragonstone one drizzly dawn, carrying an envoy from House Tyrell, a middle-aged knight named Ser Alistair Mullendor, who begged an audience. Daenerys received him in the Grand Hall. Arthur stood at her right, Barristan at her left, while Grey Worm and a handful of Unsullied flanked the dais. Ser Alistair, soaked and shivering from the cold sea, knelt to Daenerys, presenting a sealed parchment. "My lady," he said, voice quavering, "I come on behalf of Lady Olenna Tyrell, who regrets she could not make the voyage herself. She begs your indulgence and prays you might look favorably on her house. House Tyrell has faced betrayal and savage acts at King's Landing. Queen Cersei, she cares only for her own power. She destroyed the September of Bay. Lore with wildfire, killing Marjorie Tyrell among many others. The Tyrells have sworn vengeance. Lady Olenna invites you to treat with her at Highgarden. She pledges grain, gold, and the open harbor of Old Town if you will help bring down the Lannister Queen." A hush followed his words. Daenerys, seated on the basalt throne once used by Stannis, exchanged glances with Barristan and Arthur. Arthur's heart clenched at the mention of wildfire, memories stirring of the Mad King's obsession with it. Another atrocity unleashed on King's Landing. Daenerys's expression showed revulsion and, perhaps, opportunity. She rested her hands on her lap. "If Lady Olenna truly wishes alliance, we shall consider it. But I cannot leave Dragonstone undefended to travel so far. Let Lady Olenna know I will dispatch envoys to Highgarden. If the Tyrells prove sincere, then we shall stand against Cersei's tyranny together." Ser Alistair nodded eagerly. "Yes, Your Grace. Lady Olenna's words in the letter echo that. She expects your caution. She hopes to show you that the Tyrell banners still command many knights and lords of the Reach, enough to threaten King's Landing. If you join forces, the city may yield without a protracted siege." Daenerys took the parchment, glancing over its contents. Then she handed it to Missandei, who had accompanied them from Myrene after reconsidering her stay. The young Nathi woman read it quickly, confirming the knight's account. Daenerys tapped a finger against the armrest of the basalt throne. "We shall respond soon. In the meantime, you are free to rest here, Ser Alistair. We will see you provisioned for your return voyage." Thus began the forging of an alliance that might tip the balance in Westeros. Daenerys convened a council in the war room that evening. The carved map of Westeros dominated the table, with small markers for Highgarden, King's Landing, and other significant seats. Daenerys, Arthur, Barristan, Grey Worm, and Missandei debated. They concluded that an advance party would travel to the Reach, likely Barristan, as a respected knight, joined by a few men to protect him. If Lady Olenna's sincerity rang true, they would coordinate a strategy that might bring the Tyrell forces alongside Daenerys's. The final plan would be for Daenerys to deploy dragons or forces as needed, but not before ensuring they had a safe approach from Dragonstone to the coasts of the Reach. Barristan agreed to lead the diplomatic mission. Arthur offered to accompany him, but Daenerys asked him to remain at Dragonstone, where he was better known to her immediate retinue and where he could help command the fortress's defenses. "Ser Barristan has known the Tyrells for decades," Daenerys explained. "If anyone can convince them of our sincerity, it's him. But you, Ser Arthur, I need here. There may be other developments, or perhaps we'll hear from Dorne or the Stormlands. I want a knight I trust at my side." He bowed. "As you command, Your Grace." "I pray for a swift success on Ser Barristan's part." A day later, Barristan and a small escort of Unsullied set sail on a trim galley for the mouth of the Mander River. Daenerys watched them depart from the parapets, the wind tugging at her cloak. Arthur stood at her shoulder. She spoke quietly, her voice nearly lost in the roar of waves. "We must succeed here, Ser Arthur. If the Tyrells rally to us, half the realm might follow." "If they do not?" he asked. She exhaled. "Then we press on alone. We hold Dragonstone, perhaps strike at Casterly Rock or King's Landing. But that would be a savage war, and I do not crave that path." Her expression tightened. "I saw what savage war does in Slaver's Bay. I won't become a queen who bathes the realm in blood if there's another way." The sincerity in her voice stirred Arthur's old sense of honor. "The realm needs that mercy and resolve, Your Grace. Let us hope the Tyrells share your vision." As the days passed, they heard little from Barristan. Tension rose. Daenerys busied herself overseeing the fortress's upkeep, training with the Unsullied, and releasing more ravens to various lords. For his part, Arthur studied the castle's fortifications, ensuring the loyal freedmen who had traveled with them were integrated into the watch. He slept in a Spartan chamber once used by Stannis's men, waking early to practice sword forms in the courtyard. Sometimes, he glimpsed Rhaegal or Viserion perched on the black towers, their reptilian eyes watching him as though they recognized his devotion to their mother. A few skirmishes broke the routine. One occurred when a Lannister scouting ship ventured too close, likely testing the waters around Dragonstone. Arthur led a small group in a swift intercept on a longboat. They captured the Lannister vessel without bloodshed, discovering only a handful of soldiers and a knight who sneered at talk of the Mad King's spawn. The prisoners were brought to Daenerys. She offered them a chance to renounce Cersei and swear loyalty. When they refused, she ordered them confined, with instructions to treat them well. Fear might have been the simplest tactic, but Daenerys wanted them to see her as more than a tyrant. She planned to release them eventually, hoping word would spread that she was not her father. Then, after 2 more weeks, a battered galley arrived from the south, sails tattered, listing in the wind. The alarm went up, and Arthur hurried to the quayside along with Grey Worm. Their breath hitched in relief when they saw Barristan's standard. The old knight stood on the deck, visibly exhausted yet alive. Daenerys rushed from the fortress, flanked by her retinue, to greet him. Barristan's news proved both promising and worrying. The Tyrells, led by Lady Olenna, did indeed promise an alliance. They had mustered an army near Highgarden and possessed significant stores of grain. Their hatred for Cersei Lannister was profound. However, he also learned that Euron Greyjoy had allied with Cersei, raiding the coasts and capturing some of the Tyrell supply ships. This pirate lord turned king was rumored to have a formidable fleet. If Daenerys tried to sail her armies around Westeros to the Reach, they might face ambush at sea. Worse, Cersei had begun forging new alliances with lesser lords, tempting them with gold and threats. Daenerys paced the war room as Barristan recounted these details. So the Tyrells stand ready to march on King's Landing if we open a second front. But Euron's fleet could gut our approach from the sea. Barristan nodded. Yes, Lady Olenna suggests we form a two-pronged assault. Her forces strike by land from the south, while you move from Dragonstone toward King's Landing. The moment Cersei's armies split or reveal a weakness, we press the advantage. Grey Worm stood with arms folded. What about Euron's ships? Barristan's gaze flicked to the carved map. He's rumored to be near Blackwater Bay or patrolling the eastern coasts. If we lure him away with a feint, or if we destroy his ships in open battle, that might clear our route. But the man is cunning. Daenerys turned to Arthur, as though seeking his input. He studied the map. A direct naval engagement is risky. Our advantage is the dragons. If the weather and conditions allow, you could use Drogon, Rhaegal, and Viserion to burn Euron's fleet, though that is dangerous for the dragons if the ships carry scorpions or other siege weapons. Another path might be to land troops south of King's Landing, link with the Tyrells, and advance. But that means leaving Dragonstone vulnerable. The Queen pressed her lips together. We cannot do nothing, or the realm will slip further into Cersei's grip. Yet we cannot fling ourselves into open war without care. Barristan stepped forward. Lady Olenna is pressing for swift action, as she fears betrayal by some of her bannermen. If she moves alone, she'll be crushed. If you want this alliance to hold, we must show good faith soon. A hush fell, broken only by the crackle of torch flames. At length, Daenerys exhaled. Then we plan our move. We'll strike at King's Landing. We'll keep the bulk of our forces at Dragonstone for the moment, but we'll send a strong contingent by ship toward the Wendwater or Massey's Hook, an area less patrolled by Euron. If we can land near Rosby or Duskendale, we might converge on the capital from the north. Meanwhile, Lady Olenna's army approaches from the south. Cersei will be forced to defend on two fronts. Grey Worm gave a crisp nod. The Unsullied will be ready. My queen, shall I lead them? Yes, Daenerys said. I'll remain here initially with the dragons, prepared to fly at a moment's notice if Euron reveals himself or if King's Landing stands vulnerable. Ser Barristan, coordinate with the Tyrell Outriders. Ser Arthur, her gaze fixed on him. I'd have you sail with Grey Worm and the Unsullied to ensure the landing is secured. You're one of the best knights we have, and your presence there will hearten the freedmen who trust you. Arthur dipped his head. I will go, your grace, and do my utmost to see we hold the beaches. The plan thus set in motion, the fortress buzzed with preparation. Ships were assigned for the Unsullied, freedmen spearmen, and a contingent of Dothraki who dared to sail again. Arthur oversaw the distribution of arms, ensuring each group carried enough rations and siege implements. The day before departure, he stood on Dragonstone's highest battlement with Daenerys, surveying the restless sea that would be their battlefield. She turned to him, the wind toying with the braids framing her face. Travel safely, Ser Arthur. Once you hold the beaches, send word. If Euron attacks, hold as best you can until the dragons arrive. I'll do everything in my power to protect our forces. He bowed. I know you will, your grace. And if the Tyrells keep their word, we might force King's Landing to capitulate before this becomes a protracted slaughter. Her expression carried a flicker of sadness, or perhaps fear for the blood that might be spilled. Go with my blessing. Return victorious. That evening, Grey Worm's fleet set sail under cover of darkness, hoping to avoid Euron's watchers. Arthur stood on the prow of the leading galley, scanning the starlit horizon. The plan was to skirt the coast, pass Massey's Hook, and make landfall near Duskendale, an old port overshadowed by the memory of the defiance of ages past. If all went well, They would disembark quickly and fortify their position before Cersei's forces could respond. But war rarely goes as planned. Soon enough, they encountered roiling seas, then a sudden gale that scattered part of the fleet. They spent 3 days regrouping, battered by high waves and relentless wind. Morale dipped, especially among the freedmen unaccustomed to such storms. Arthur moved from ship to ship whenever possible, encouraging them, reminding them of Daenerys's faith and the promise of a freer realm. Still, a gloom settled over them. The coastline was never far from sight, but no safe harbor presented itself until they neared the waters north of Massey's Hook. At last, in a gray dawn half-shrouded by mist, the fleet rounded a headland. A wide bay opened, fringed by farmland dotted with occasional windmills. Duskendale lay further up the coast, beyond sight. The plan was to avoid directly hitting the port, which might be garrisoned, and instead land on a secluded stretch of beach. That morning, Arthur and Grey Worm surveyed the terrain from the deck. Thick clouds obscured the sun. A drizzle fell, chilling them to the bone. "The tide is in our favor," Grey Worm said in his succinct manner. "We land now." Arthur peered through the drifting haze. "Yes, we must make the beachhead before any scouts spot us. Tell the men to be ready." He turned to the freedman officer at his side. "If we encounter Lannister or Crownland forces, we form ranks behind the Unsullied. We have to unload quickly." With that, the ships advanced to shallow waters. Small landing craft were lowered, carrying squads of Unsullied, freedmen, and Dothraki riders leading their horses with subdued unease. Arthur climbed into one such craft, bracing as the oarsmen pulled for shore. Fine sand appeared through the fog. The hush was eerie. No horns blared, no sign of watchers perched on the cliffs. Perhaps fortune favored them. They grounded with a soft crunch. Grey Worm leapt from the boat, spear in hand, scanning the dunes. The first wave dashed up the beach, forming a defensive ring, while the next wave followed with crates and equipment. Arthur slogged through ankle-deep water, sword drawn. The smell of wet seaweed clung to the air. Despite the swirling tension, no immediate foe appeared. The beach lay silent, dotted with the remains of driftwood. Within an hour, they established a rudimentary camp amid the dunes. Tents rose, sentries posted on the higher ridges. More boats arrived. Arthur found relief that their approach seemed unnoticed, or at least uncontested. The freedmen breathed easier, starting small cookfires. Even the Dothraki relaxed, many letting their horses tread the wet sands. By midday, a measure of calm settled over the camp, though no one forgot their readiness for war. Arthur climbed one of the dunes, scanning inland. Rolling fields stretched away, dotted with scattered farmsteads. He spotted a thin ribbon of roadway leading north. The plan was to advance carefully toward Duskendale or Rosby, then link with any Tyrell outriders who might approach from the south. But for the moment, they needed to entrench, construct palisades, ensure supply lines to the ships. Grey Worm joined him on the dune, regarding the farmland with an impassive gaze. "No sign of enemy," the Unsullied commander observed. "Not yet," Arthur agreed. "I suggest we send out small patrols, not large enough to rouse suspicion if scouts are about, but enough to warn us if a Lannister force approaches." Grey Worm nodded. "I will do it. You remain here. I'll prepare the defenses," Arthur said. Scanning the horizon one last time before descending the slope, they spent 2 days fortifying, building a makeshift barricade near the edge of the dunes, while the ships remained anchored offshore. The freedmen scouted local farms. Some had owners who cowered in fear or fled. Others were abandoned. Food stores were meager, but they found enough to supplement their rations. Not a single Lannister soldier was sighted. It was unsettling, as though the land were holding its breath. On the third night, Arthur awoke to the sound of a distant horn. He bolted upright in his tent, grabbing his sword. Shouts rose in the darkness, Unsullied calling orders, freedmen fumbling for weapons. The horn blew again, from the direction of the sea. He rushed outside into the cold night air, cloak flapping around his shoulders. Overhead, the stars shone bright, the half-moon casting pale light across the dunes. Grey Worm appeared at his side, spear in hand. A ship's horn. Something is wrong. They sprinted to the highest dune. Far offshore, they saw flickers of torchlight, and other lights too, gliding across the water with ominous purpose. Arthur's breath caught. Ships, many ships, smaller, faster craft than those belonging to Daenerys. Even from a distance, he could see the shapes of kraken-like prows. Euron Greyjoy's fleet. One of Daenerys's war galleys tried to maneuver away, but jets of flame erupted on its deck. Fire arrows, or perhaps pots of burning pitch. The battered vessel reeled, listing heavily. In the moonlight, Arthur glimpsed the swirl of grappling hooks thrown from Euron's reavers. The clash of steel drifted across the water. He felt a surge of horror and anger. Their fleet was under ambush. "We must get to the ships," one freedman shouted. But Grey Worm raised a hand in grim denial. "It's too late to sail out in the dark. We'd be slaughtered. Euron's men are prepared. They knew our location." Arthur forced himself to breathe. He must have been scouting, or perhaps Cersei had informants. "If we charge the beach with small boats, we'll be cut down. But we can't just let them burn the fleet." Grey Worm's tone was steady as stone. "We do not have a choice. To row into them is suicide. Let us rally the men. If Euron tries to land and attack the camp, we defend." A pang of helplessness gripped Arthur, but he couldn't refute Grey Worm's logic. In the darkness, Euron's reavers already had the advantage. More horns sounded at sea. Cries and shrieks told of men dying on blazing decks. One by one, the silhouettes of Daenerys' ships wreathed in flames. Some tried to slip away, but Euron's corsairs gave chase, ramming hulls, boarding with lethal efficiency. Arthur could only watch from the shore in sickened fury. At length, as the sky began to lighten, the last of the Queen's ships in that anchorage lay crippled or burned. The reaver fleet loomed offshore, black sails fluttering. Arthur braced for an assault on the beach, but it never came. Perhaps Euron believed he had accomplished enough by trapping them on land and denying them an easy retreat. Or perhaps he bided his time to strike again. Either way, the loss was devastating. Their supply lines afloat were now crippled, leaving only what they had brought ashore. Dawn found the camp in a somber hush. The freedmen stared out at the smoldering wrecks. Bodies bobbed in the tide, and a few survivors crawled to shore, half dead from smoke inhalation or sword wounds. Arthur led rescue efforts, pulling men from the waves. Many died in his arms. Grey Worm and the Unsullied were stoic, but behind their discipline lay the stark realization that they were stranded. Arthur clenched his jaw at the sight of a freedman he recognized. An older man who had once worked in Myreen's stables, lying face down in the surf. "We cannot remain here," he told Grey Worm once they'd done what they could for the wounded. "If Euron doesn't land, then we face a slow death by attrition. We must move inland, try to link with the Tyrells or any local allies." Grey Worm agreed. They assembled what remained of their force. The Dothraki, fewer in number, gathered their horses. The freedmen looked shaken, but they still had fight in them. The Unsullied formed up, silent and resolute. Arthur addressed them all from a low dune, voice echoing in the morning light. "Brothers and sisters, we have lost our ships, but not our spirit. The Queen sent us here to secure this beachhead. We have done so, but Euron Greyjoy has cut us off from the sea. We cannot remain in these dunes, waiting to starve or be overrun. We must march inland. Somewhere ahead, Lady Olenna Tyrell's forces may be marching as well. If we can unite, we can still bring justice to the realm and to the Queen's enemies. Remain strong. We will avenge those we lost here." A low murmur spread among the freedmen and Unsullied, resolve returning to eyes still brimming with grief. Grey Worm took command of the main column. Arthur joined the vanguard, scanning the horizon for possible threats. They marched from the beach in a tight formation, leaving the dunes behind. Many looked back with sorrow, glimpsing the charred remains of the once proud ships that had carried them from Essos. Their only hope now was to move swiftly, forging north or west toward any stronghold that might favor Daenerys. If the local villages remained loyal to the crown, they could face ambush at every turn. The farmland they passed was eerily quiet. Peasants hid in their huts if they hadn't fled entirely. A pair of freedmen scouts caught a local shepherd who trembled under questioning. He confessed to seeing Lannister outriders in the region days past. He also claimed a large Tyrell army was rumored to be on the march, possibly near the Mander. That was some faint encouragement. For 3 days, they traveled over rolling plains and through low hills, rationing their supplies carefully. Occasionally, they glimpsed the sea, where Euron's sails prowled the coastline, but the Reavers made no attempt to land. Perhaps they trusted that Daenerys's army was beaten. Arthur prayed the Ironborn would not realize how vulnerable the main column was. If attacked, they had no ships to run back to, and the country offered few natural defenses. Nonetheless, the Unsullied retained perfect discipline, while the freedmen stiffened their resolve. On the 4th day, they spotted a riderless horse galloping across a field, saddle askew, foam flecking its mouth. Arthur sent a scout to intercept. The horse belonged to a Tyrell outrider. The scout discovered, judging by the green embroidered saddlecloth. Pressing onward, they found more signs of battle. Churned mud, broken spears, a few scattered corpses wearing half-crushed rose emblems. Something had transpired here recently. When they crested a rise, the smell of smoke reached them. In the valley below, farmland burned in patches, and the remains of a small battle were clear. Bodies strewn among churned-up earth, leftover arrows stuck in the ground. Lannister crimson mingled with Tyrell green. Arthur led a cautious advance, aware that ambushers could lie in wait. But the field was abandoned save for the dead and dying. Freedmen rushed to give aid to any survivors, but there were precious few. One Tyrell man-at-arms, clutching a grievous wound in his side, coughed out that a larger Lannister host had struck them the previous day and moved on south. He spat blood, eyes gleaming with sorrow. The old lady, Lady Olenna, she's out there trying to bring her forces around, but they keep hounding us, dividing our ranks. We can't gather in one place without the Lannisters smashing us. They have new allies, Storm's End men, maybe, some Sells words. He trailed off, slipping into unconsciousness. A freedman tried to stanch his wound, but it was too late. Arthur's heart sank. They had landed expecting to march unopposed to unify with Tyrell forces. Instead, the Tyrells were scattered, harried by Lannister columns. If they were pinned down, how could Daenerys's relatively small expedition hope to break the Lannister lines alone? He remembered the Queen's words. If the Tyrells fail, we face a protracted war. And they were practically cornered between the sea and an enemy that outnumbered them. Grey Worm approached, surveying the carnage. We cannot fight an entire Lannister army with what we have, he said quietly. We must find Lady Olenna or her main host, if it still stands. Arthur nodded, controlling a flash of frustration. Yes, we'll track them, see if we can join them. If the Tyrells remain scattered, we'll vanish as well, picked off. We should move north, following the route of the Lannister columns. With luck, we'll find the Tyrell main body. Or they'll find us. The column marched onward, traversing farmlands scorched by conflict. Each day, they found more evidence of skirmishes, broken wagons, scorched camps, corpses stripped of gear. Once, they came across a Lannister outrider party that had apparently met a group of Dothraki. The Dothraki had left few survivors. Arthur recognized the savage style of their kills. The freedmen muttered that they had parted ways with the Dothraki ships earlier. Perhaps a separate contingent had landed further along the coast. If so, they were on the same mission but just as cut off. At last, near dusk on the 6th day since the beach landing, they beheld a sight that brought a measure of hope. A large Tyrell banner fluttering over a crude palisade in the distance, perched on a small ridge. Knights in green cloaks patrolled the perimeter. Grey Worm dispatched an envoy under a white flag. Arthur waited tensely. If the Tyrells refused them or suspected treachery, they could be forced into a desperate fight. But soon enough, the envoy returned, waving them forward. The Tyrell outpost had recognized Daenerys's colors on the freedman's insignia and the Unsullied's presence. They were invited inside. Relief swept through the exhausted column. They trudged up the slope, passing a line of Tyrell bowmen who kept their arrows nocked, obviously wary of strangers. Inside the makeshift camp, a ring of battered tents and wagons sheltered an army perhaps 2,000 strong, far smaller than what Arthur expected from Highgarden's might. Among them, wounded men groaned on bedrolls, women tended pot cauldrons, and knights stood in clusters, whispering about Lannister sightings. A tall knight with a bandaged arm greeted them. "I am Ser Garibald of House Hightower. You come in the name of Daenerys Targaryen?" Grey Worm gave a curt nod. "Yes, I am Grey Worm, commander of her Unsullied. This is Ser Arthur Dayne, her sworn knight." A flicker of shock crossed Ser Garibald's features, no doubt at hearing the name Arthur Dayne, who was supposed to be decades dead. But he recovered quickly. "Welcome, though I fear you'll find little comfort here. Lady Olenna is not with us. She took the main bulk of her forces south, hoping to catch the Lannisters near the Mander. We're the rearguard, pinned by repeated attacks. The Lannisters harass us with swift columns of cavalry, while Euron Greyjoy's raids prevent supplies from reaching us by ship. It's a devilish noose." Arthur surveyed the camp, noting the weary expressions, the half-empty supply wagons. They were in dire straits. "How far is Lady Olenna's host?" "Hard to say. She was heading for a crossing near Bitterbridge, last I heard, possibly to link with any Tarly men who remain loyal, but rumors say Randall Tarly marched for the crown. Our intelligence is limited. Ravens rarely get through." Grey Worm lifted his chin. "We are also cut off. Our ships were burned. We have no quick way to send word to our queen or to rejoin her at Dragonstone." Ser Garibald's face creased with worry. "Then it seems we share a fate. We can hold this ridge for now, but eventually the Lannisters will bring a larger force. We prayed Daenerys's armies would roll over them from the east, but it appears we all misjudged how swiftly the crown could muster allies." Arthur's gut churned. They needed to regroup, fortify, and somehow break the blockade. "We might consider a bold strike," he said slowly. "If we remain pinned, we'll be whittled away. If we can push north to Rosby or Duskendale, we might find a route to King's Landing, or at least force the Lannisters to retreat. Or we ride south to find Lady Olenna's main host. But traveling with so many wounded would be perilous." Ser Garibald rubbed his brow, as if balancing 1,000 burdens. "We have not the strength to launch an offensive. The men are exhausted, half-starved. But if your Unsullied are as fearsome as tales claim, perhaps a swift night march." He trailed off, uncertain. Grey Worm's gaze flicked to Arthur. "We have about 4,000 soldiers total, 2,000 freedmen, 2,000 Unsullied, plus some Dothraki outriders. Many of our own are battered from the crossing and lack sufficient food. But we do not fear to fight. If Lady Olenna's troops are near, we might attempt to break through to them." A heavy silence settled. Finally, Arthur made a decision. "We'll rest here tonight. At dawn, we gather intelligence. If the Lannisters are massing near us, we must choose the path of action quickly. The Queen entrusted us to aid the Tyrells. Let us do so or die in the attempt." He felt the weight of that vow pressing him. He remembered the vow he once made to Rhaegar, how it ended in blood on the stones of the Tower of Joy. Now he served Rhaegar's sister, a queen of dragons, striving to unify a fractious realm. War had a cruel way of uprooting even the best-laid plans. But he would not falter. That night, as he lay in a borrowed tent within the Tyrell camp, the sounds of men groaning in pain, the wind sighing over the ridge, he prayed silently for Daenerys's eventual arrival. If she brought her dragons, perhaps they could turn the tide. If not, they might perish in these fields. At dawn, Tyrell lookouts reported Lannister outriders on the move just a few miles west. Arthur rose with the light, strapped on his armor, and joined Grey Worm at the main gate. The freedmen mustered under battered standards once used in Slaver's Bay. The Unsullied formed ranks, expressionless behind their spears. Tyrell knights readied horses. Arthur conferred with Ser Garibald, deciding on a cautious advance. They could not stay pinned on this ridge with so many wounded. They would march, form a battle line if challenged, and hope the Lannisters hesitated to engage. The morning mists clung to the low ground as they set out. Arthur rode a sturdy brown courser, scanning the farmland ahead. Sparse trees dotted the fields. The road lay soft from recent rains, rutted by wagons. The column moved in somber silence. Grey Worm marched at the center with the Unsullied, freedmen spaced at intervals. Tyrell knights flanked them, some mounted, some forced to walk from lack of steeds. After an hour, horns blared from the flanks. A mounted scout galloped in, breathless. Sire, Lannister cavalry approaching, 200 or more. Banners of House Lefford and a Sellsword company. From the look of it, Arthur's heart lurched. Only 200, but that might be the vanguard of a larger force. Form ranks, he bellowed. The freedmen and Tyrell foot hurried into a shield wall. The Unsullied pivoted with precision, raising shields and spears. Knights with horses readied a countercharge. Arthur rode to Grey Worm's side. We must hold them back, or at least blunt their charge. The Lannister cavalry soon appeared, scarlet banners flapping. They cantered across the fields, a gleaming wave of steel lances and war horses. Arthur's mouth went dry. Even disciplined lines could break under a well-timed cavalry charge. Yet the Unsullied had proven their mettle time and again. He circled behind the lines, shouting encouragement. Freedmen set their spears, faces pale. A horn blast from the Lannisters signaled their charge. They thundered forward, hooves shaking the earth. Arthur urged his courser into position at the front, brandishing his sword. "Steady!" he shouted. "Hold!" They collided in a deafening crash of metal and screams. Unsullied spears impaled the first ranks of horses, sending beasts and riders sprawling. Lannister lances shattered on shields. Freedmen jabbed at falling men, finishing them off. Yet the second wave pushed through the initial brunt, swirling among the ranks. Chaos erupted. Arthur parried a sword stroke from a Sellsword with a black mustache, then countered with a riposte that slashed the man's throat. He wheeled his horse around, hacking at another rider's exposed back. The freedman to his left crumpled beneath a warhorse's hooves. Everywhere, dust and blood clouded the air. The Unsullied, unflinching, pressed forward in disciplined files, cutting down any rider who lingered within reach. Grey Worm led them with ruthless skill, spearing a dismounted knight through the throat. Tyrell knights circled to the flanks, engaging in desperate melee. Arthur saw Ser Garibald go down under a tangle of lances, but he couldn't reach him in time. Gradually, the Lannister cavalry realized they were outmatched by the combined infantry and stiff discipline. Their impetus spent, they tried to withdraw. Arthur, spattered in blood, urged the freedmen to push after them. A few riders fled, vanishing over the fields. The rest lay dead or wounded. The cost to Daenerys's forces was heavy. Dozens of freedmen and Tyrell men littered the ground, and an entire flank of Unsullied had been battered. But they stood victorious for the moment. Arthur dismounted, breathing hard. Grey Worm approached, face set. "We hold the field, but more will come." Arthur swallowed back the bitterness. Yes, this was likely a probing force. We must keep moving. If they circle around with a larger host, we'll be trapped. They tended quickly to the wounded, gathered weapons from the fallen, and resumed the march. The freedmen were grim-faced, silent in their determination. The Tyrell knights who remained spoke in hushed tones about the main Lannister army. Every step carried them deeper into uncertain territory. Still, no word from Daenerys or her dragons. Arthur could only hope she was maneuvering from Dragonstone or striking at another front. By dusk, they reached a shallow stream. Beyond it loomed a cluster of hills that might provide a defensible position. As they forded the waters, Arthur's scouts returned with dire news. A large body of Lannister troops was indeed converging from the west, likely aiming to catch them in open terrain. The only recourse was to take the hills and hope to form a defensive circle. Wearily, the column ascended the slopes, collapsing into a makeshift camp behind a ring of rocks and scrub. Night brought cold winds and tension. Fires burned low, men huddled for warmth. Arthur patrolled the perimeter, hearing freedmen whisper prayers to the Mother of Dragons or to whatever gods they remembered. Tyrell men cursed under their breath, lamenting the fate of Highgarden. Arthur felt the press of hopelessness too, yet he would not let it consume him. He thought of Daenerys's vow, the burning spirit in her eyes. If she were truly the rightful queen, if the Red Priests had raised him to serve a greater cause, then this was not the end. He was halfway around the perimeter when he glimpsed a faint light flicker across the sky, distant but unmistakable. It shimmered again, a swirl of orange sparks. At first, he thought it might be a shooting star. Then came a deep, throbbing roar. His heart leapt. A dragon's roar. "By the Seven," he breathed. Men around him stirred, eyes scanning the moonlit sky. The light resolved into a brilliant silhouette. A dragon, wreathed in flames, soaring over the far ridges. Arthur's vision blurred with fierce hope. Could Daenerys have come at last? Moments later, the roar intensified. A second shape emerged, then a third. Regal and Viserion or Drogon among them, he couldn't be certain. But three enormous winged forms glided across the starry vault, molten eyes ablaze. From somewhere beyond the hills, horns blasted, joined by the distant clash of steel. Arthur realized with a spike of exhilaration that there was another battlefield not far from here, and the dragons were unleashing their fury. Grey Worm appeared at his side. "We must move, help the queen," the unsullied commander said, voice sharper than usual. "Yes," Arthur agreed. "Gather the men. This is our chance." No one questioned the order. Freedmen leapt to their feet, ignoring exhaustion. The Tyrell Knights, upon hearing talk of dragons in the sky, rushed to strap on armor. The entire camp mustered, forming ragged columns that pounded down the slope under the moonlight. An urgent energy replaced despair. If Daenerys was near, they could still turn the tide. They marched at a near run, guided by the glow of distant fires. Soon, they heard the tumult of battle. Screams, crashing metal, the shriek of terrified horses. Over a final ridge they went, until the battlefield lay spread out below. Flames danced, revealing a column of Lannister infantry pinned between a towering black dragon. Drogon unmistakably, breathing arcs of fire, and ranks of mounted Dothraki who whooped as they slashed through the disorder. Another flank of Lannister troops, partially organized, tried to hold formation against two smaller dragons swooping overhead. Arthur's eyes stung with the heat of the flames. At the center of it all, perched on Drogon's back, was Daenerys Targaryen, silver hair glinting in the firelight. She guided the dragon with fierce purpose, scorching lines of Lannister soldiers who dared hold their ground. The smell of burning flesh and charred metal filled the night air. Arthur felt a rush of triumph. "Forward," he bellowed. "For the queen!" Grey Worm raised his spear high, and the freedmen and unsullied streamed down the slope in a wave of renewed hope. Tyrell Knights joined them, the green rose of Highgarden blending into the swirl of chaos. Arthur charged with them, sword aloft, plunging into the disordered flank of the Lannister force. The enemy, already beset by dragonfire, reeled at this fresh assault. Men broke and ran or died where they stood. Arthur's sword flashed, cutting a path through the Lannister ranks. Freedmen poured around him, their shouts echoing with righteous fury. Unsullied advanced in relentless steps, spearing anyone who resisted. Overhead, Drogon circled, unleashing fresh torrents of flame that lit the entire field in an infernal glow. Before long, the Lannister line collapsed. Shouts of surrender filled the air. Some tried to flee, but Dothraki riders harried them. Others cast down their weapons and fell to their knees. Arthur skidded to a halt beside a charred oak tree. Freedmen rushed past, binding prisoners. The stench of scorched earth clogged his nostrils. Then, with a thunderous beat of wings, Drogon landed amidst the carnage, sending embers whirling. Daenerys dismounted, eyes scanning the battlefield. She spotted Arthur, and the look of relief on her face was profound. He hurried to her, dropping to one knee in the midst of the bloody field. Around them, Dothraki hooped in victory, freedmen cheered, and the dragons roared their conquest to the moonlit heavens. Daenerys extended a hand, breath still ragged from riding. "Ser Arthur, you live." He rose, pressing a fist to his heart. "Thanks to you, your grace. We were stranded after Euron Greyjoy destroyed our ships, pinned inland. We joined Tyrell rearguards and nearly lost hope, until we heard you in the sky." She nodded, taking in the ragged freedmen, the battered unsullied, the Tyrell knights slogging through the remains. "I flew from Dragonstone with the dragons when I learned from Barristan that the Tyrell armies were in peril. He discovered Euron's movement, and we realized your force might be trapped. We had to strike quickly, so we came by land with a large Dothraki horde, some freedmen, and the dragons to break their lines. The main Tyrell host is south, led by Lady Olenna, but we aim to create enough havoc to free them from the Lannister blockade. It seems we succeeded." Arthur glanced around, exhaustion washing over him. "Yes, your grace. The day, no, the night is ours. Many men died, but the Lannisters have been routed." Daenerys's face tightened, as though sorrowing for the carnage, but she squared her shoulders. "War spares no one. Now, at least the path is open for the Tyrells. We will gather our forces, regroup. Then we move on King's Landing. Cersei must answer for what she's done." Drogon stomped the earth, releasing a final billow of smoke from his nostrils. Grey Worm approached, saluting. The freedmen and Dothraki parted in reverent awe, chanting Daenerys's titles. The dragons soared overhead in a triumphant arc. And there, in the flickering red glow of embers, with the night sky shimmering above, Arthur Dayne felt the cord of destiny tighten once more. If the Red Priests had raised him for a purpose, it was here, standing beside the Mother of Dragons as she delivered the realm from tyranny. He saw in her eyes the reflection of everything Rhaegar had dreamed of, a united realm, a burning dawn. And though more battles loomed, though Cersei Lannister and Euron Greyjoy still stood in defiance, the tide had turned. He sheathed his sword, stepping closer so only she might hear his voice. "Your Grace," he said, "I swore I will. Do not fail you. We stand on the edge of a new age, one shaped by your mercy and your fire. The realm may not yet realize it, but you are the dawn they need." Daenerys, spattered in soot and the blood of war, managed a gentle smile. "Then let us break this long night together, Ser Arthur." Around them, the clang of arms subsided into the crackle of burning wagons, the soft moans of the wounded. Soldiers shouted in victory, others wept in relief. Overhead, the dragons roared once more, their voices echoing across the hills. The Queen had come, and with her the promise that a Targaryen might again hold the Iron Throne. Arthur Dayne stood beside her, no longer haunted by old ghosts, resolved to see the vision through. If prophecy spoke true, a greater darkness awaited in the north. But for tonight, on this field of embers, they had struck a mighty blow against the tyranny of the crown. And so they turned toward the next horizon, forging onward toward King's Landing, bearing the dragon's flame and the starborn sword together into the unknown dawn.